Welcome to BeFrightened. We tell stories that will keep you up or help you sleep at night. Thank you for joining me. Get comfortable and grab a glass of water. Before we begin, make sure you've locked your doors, closed your windows, and turned off the lights. While you're getting cozy, don't forget to say hello in the comments and let us know where you're listening from. And like and subscribe to BeFrightened for more scary stories. These stories are a compilation sourced from our most recent videos, so you might recognize some of them. Now, it's time to close your eyes and enjoy the journey. Sweet dreams, and I'll be seeing you in your nightmares, but hopefully not. My name is Mia, and you might remember my other story from your Scary Alone at Night Stories video, Story 3. At the start of that story, I mentioned that I had issues at my previous job, which was the reason I ended up changing jobs. This is the story of what happened before that, leading me to leave. You could call this the prequel to that story. Back then, I worked in inventory and warehouse management at a small warehouse during the day. During my first year in that job, there was a guy named Dylan. He was around my age, the son of the business owner, and I didn't know much about him other than that. We didn't have a big staff, maybe one or two others around during the day, and Dylan would come in sometimes to help with operations. I'm not sure exactly when he started working there, but he was there when I started. We worked together a handful of times. I would manage the inventory and handle other warehouse tasks. A few times I spoke briefly with Dylan, but not too much. He seemed fine for the most part, but wasn't the type of person I would usually spend time with outside of work. I remember one afternoon, we both finished our shifts at the same time. It was around 5 p.m. I had been working near the loading area, and he had been in another part of the warehouse. As we were both clocking out, he asked if I drove there, and I replied that I did. He then asked if I could give him a ride home. I didn't mind too much, but I asked where he lived. He said he lived in a neighborhood not far from mine, maybe 5 minutes out of the way, so it wasn't a big deal. I said yes, and then we left the warehouse together. We got into my car, and he gave me directions to his place. He lived in an older house on the outskirts of town. He thanked me for the ride and got out of the car, and I went home. I didn't think much of it. The next day, I worked an earlier shift. My availability was flexible because I didn't have other commitments. Dylan wasn't working that day, though. It was around noon, and the warehouse was quiet. I was working in the back, organizing some boxes, when I saw someone walking toward me aggressively. She had long, dark hair, and she was tall, and she was strong-looking, like she worked out a lot. She came right up to me and asked me who the hell I thought I was. I had no idea what she was talking about, so I told her I didn't know who she was. She said she was Dylan's friend and accused me of trying to steal Dylan's attention from her. I realized there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. Either that, or this woman was just jealous of the attention Dylan had given me. I really didn't want to get involved in their drama. She was right up in my face, asking if I thought I was something special. I told her to calm down and said I didn't do anything with Dylan. I explained that Dylan had asked me for a ride home, and she told me Dylan could have asked her instead. I said I didn't know that, and I didn't know who she was, or even know they were close. She seemed to calm down a little bit. I assured her that nothing had happened, and there was no reason to be upset. She told me I better watch myself, and then walked away. After that interaction, I was surprised by how angry she got. I started to wonder if Dylan was involved in something toxic. The next time I worked with Dylan was a couple of days later. I saw him and asked how he was doing. He told me that he was doing well and was planning to move to Denver in a few days. We lived in a medium-sized town in Oregon, so that was a pretty big move. I told him that was great, but mentioned that his friend had confronted me recently. He apologized profusely, and went on to explain that they had broken up a while ago, and she had been upset ever since. I mentioned that it seemed like she thought I had something to do with their breakup, though I knew I had absolutely nothing to do with it. To me, she seemed like your run-of-the-mill insecure, jealous type. He said that was ridiculous, and I had nothing to do with it. I told him that I knew that, and that he should let her know that, but Dylan said he had her blocked on everything, and wasn't going to contact her anymore. I realized at that point that she was just using me as an outlet for her anger. I considered involving the police, but wasn't sure if it was necessary. That night, Dylan left before I did, and I stayed behind to finish some work. Grateful, as there was no way I would drive him home again. In the days that followed, I started noticing her presence, even in places where it didn't make sense. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, I noticed a car parked across the street. At first, it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary, but then I saw her sitting inside. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, watching through the open window. I didn't think much of it and drove home, chalking it up to coincidence. Maybe she was waiting for Dylan. The next morning, on my way to work, I saw the same car following me as I drove to the warehouse. That's when I started feeling really uneasy. A couple of days later, I spotted the same car again while I was grabbing a coffee before work. The shop was a regular stop for me, and when I saw her sitting in the parking lot, her eyes following my every move through the open window, it became clear that this was no coincidence. One evening, after finishing my shift, I walked out to my car and noticed her car parked nearby. My frustration grew, but when I got closer to my car, she got out and started walking toward me, looking really pissed off. I asked her why she was following me, but she didn't answer. She just kept coming closer. She got right up in my face and threw a punch. I moved, but she still grazed the side of my head. I swung back but missed, and then she got me real good. I hate to admit it, but I got beat up pretty badly. It was clear this wasn't her first fight. She hit me 4 or 5 times, and I managed to get a punch or two in, but it didn't do much. I fell to the ground, and after that, she walked off and went back to her car. I was relieved she didn't kick me while I was down. She drove away, and I stayed there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, I called the police and told them everything. They showed up not long after, and I got checked out by paramedics, but luckily, I only had bruises and scrapes, no major injuries. The police said they would look into it, and the next day, I heard that Dylan's friend had been arrested. Apparently, she already had a warrant for failing to show up in court on a different charge. She had a bit of a criminal history. I filed charges for the assault, and it was a relief to know she wouldn't be around anymore. After everything that had happened, I was angry about getting mixed up in it, but I decided it was time to quit and move on to bigger and better things. That led to my next job on the night shift, where, well, let's just say, trouble has a way of finding me, no matter the time of day. Hopefully, though, this is the last story you get from me. I was driving home from a party at a friend's place late at night, and the roads were dead quiet. It was just past midnight, and the suburban streets were completely empty. The roads at that time of night were usually peaceful, and tonight seemed no different. As I got closer to the woodsy part of the road, only about 15 minutes from home, I saw headlights in the distance. Nothing about it seemed strange at first, but as they approached, the lights became blindingly bright. I tried to keep my eyes focused on the road, but it got harder the closer the car got. Then, just when I thought it would pass me, I realized the car wasn't in its lane. It was heading straight at me, driving on the wrong side of the road. Instinct took over, my tires screeching as I veered off and crashed into a ditch. For a second, I sat frozen, gathering myself and checking myself over. I shoved the door open and scrambled out of the car, my heart racing as I looked down the road. The car that nearly ran me off the road had stopped just ahead. The headlights were off now, and for a moment, I thought maybe they'd pulled over to help. But there was no movement, no sense of urgency from them. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what just happened. My anger quickly took over as I climbed out of the ditch, brushing dirt off myself. How could they be so reckless? I was alive, but my car was totaled, and they'd almost killed me. I wasn't sure if they were drunk or just didn't care, but either way, I was furious. I started walking toward their car, demanding some sort of explanation. That's when I saw the driver get out. A guy, maybe in his 30s, looking confused, as if he didn't understand what he had just done. I was ready to let him have it, but before I could even say anything, he started yelling back at me, saying something about me driving on the wrong side of the road. My anger spiked, and I was ready to argue, but something about his voice threw me off. His accent. It wasn't American. That's when it clicked. He wasn't from here. He sounded British, and from the way he was shouting, it was clear he thought I was the one in the wrong. He must have been driving as if he were still in the UK, where they drive on the opposite side. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him, but my frustration was too strong. This guy had nearly killed me. He kept shouting at me. He thought he was in the right, as if I was the one breaking the rules. I tried to get a word in, to tell him he was on the wrong side of the road, but he wasn't having any of it. His passenger got out too. She was trying to calm him down, but it wasn't working. He was too worked up, insisting that I was the problem. Realizing the gravity of the mistake, I backed off for a moment and took a deep breath. I wasn't getting anywhere with him, and there was no way I was going to handle this on my own. I hurried back to my car and grabbed my phone. I called 911, giving them my location and explaining what had happened. They told me they'd send someone over right away. As I waited for the cops, I stood by my car, trying to keep my distance from the couple. They were still bickering, but it seemed like he was starting to piece together what had really happened. Then, they both fell silent. The realization must have sunk in. They hadn't been paying attention to the road signs. It was an honest mistake, but it was one that nearly cost me my life. The guy, finally understanding what he'd done, looked over at me, his anger melting into something more like embarrassment. After things calmed down, he walked over and explained they had just arrived in the country earlier that night, flying in from the UK. After the police arrived, they took both of our statements and quickly understood what had happened. With no injuries and no malicious intent, they treated it as a case of confusion due to unfamiliarity with local traffic rules. The tourists were still a bit shaken, but after talking for a while, it was clear they felt bad about the whole situation. We calmed down, had a polite conversation, and even exchanged contact details for the insurance report. By the time my car was being loaded onto the tow truck, things had settled, and they apologized once again. A few months later, I had a work trip to the UK, and the memory of that night crossed my mind. One simple mistake had almost escalated into something far worse. And I'll admit, when I was there, I didn't even dare to drive on their roads. The thought of driving on the left side of the road was enough to keep me from getting behind the wheel during my trip. I began using Tinder back in the early days, around 2014. Looking back, I can't help but partially blame myself for what happened later. You see, on my Tinder profile, I'd gone a bit overboard trying to appear wealthier than I really was. I had photos in front of a rented Ferrari, standing by a yacht that wasn't mine, and pretending to be on a private jet that was just a prop for photos. At the end of the day, though, I was just a regular Joe. This story begins with me matching this stunningly beautiful young woman named Helen. Our initial messages led to a suggestion to meet in person. Helen agreed, which led me to offer my phone number so we could coordinate more easily. However, Helen insisted that we keep all communication on the platform until after the date, explaining that she wanted to feel comfortable before giving out her number. Understandable, I thought. Safety first. It seemed like a reasonable request, and I respected her caution. A quaint coffee shop downtown became Helen's suggested meeting spot. Arriving 15 minutes early, I found the place closed for the day. Monday evening at 7 p.m. explained the shutdown. My message to Helen about the closure received a quick reply. She recommended a bar just a block away, mentioning that it was close to her home and that she would be there soon. She urged me to hurry, as she was eager to meet me, and even suggested a shortcut through a nearby alleyway to get there faster. The walk towards the new location revealed a poorly lit, deserted alley. Hesitating briefly, I decided to take the shortcut, not wanting to keep Helen waiting. The alley was narrow and dark, with only a faint glow from distant streetlights. Halfway through, two masked men emerged from the shadows, brandishing knives. Before I could react, one man grabbed me from behind, while the other held a knife to my throat. The man with the knife sneered, telling me,
"Helen sends her love, loser."
They demanded my wallet, watch, and phone. Shocked and terrified, I complied without resistance. My expensive watch, a gift from my parents, was roughly yanked off my wrist. They rifled through my pockets, taking everything of value. The muggers shoved me to the ground and disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared. Shaken and bruised, I picked myself up, realizing the gravity of what had just happened. Helen had set me up. For the past couple of years, I've been harboring a secret that's been eating away at me. It's a chilling experience that I've barely shared with anyone, mainly because even now, it makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. I'm just grateful I made it through unscathed. I've finally gathered the courage to open up about that night. It was around October 2022, and I had been working a late-night shift at a 24-hour diner in a small university town here in Canada. We had rotating shifts, and I was clocking out at about 2:45 a.m. I was absolutely exhausted from serving hungry students and night owls. I lived about a 15 to 20-minute walk from work, which usually didn't bother me. I couldn't afford to take ride shares often, so I'd gotten used to walking home late at night, especially since I'd never had any issues before. That night, as I left work and began my walk, everything seemed normal. The streets were quiet, mostly deserted. I was just a few minutes from home when I saw him, just standing there at the corner where I would usually turn to head to my apartment. At first glance, I tried not to overreact, but something about him made me feel uneasy. He was leaning casually against a street sign, watching me approach. His appearance didn't scream danger right away. He was dressed casually, looked like he was in his early 30s, and had a stocky build. His skin had a pale complexion, and there was this overpowering scent of cigarette smoke wafting toward me, even though I was still several feet away. But something about the situation just felt off. As I got closer, he made his move. He stepped away from the street sign and walked straight toward me, cutting off my path. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I tried to remain composed. He started asking me questions. Where I was going, if I lived nearby, complimenting my hair. I should have ignored him, but I didn't. I gave vague answers, thinking that would be enough to make him lose interest, but it wasn't. He was insistent, too insistent. As we talked, his expression never changed, but it wasn't friendly. It was unsettling, calculating. He started getting closer, reaching out to touch my shoulder and trying to grab my hand. My skin crawled, and I stepped back, making it clear I didn't want him near me. But he just laughed it off, dismissing my discomfort as if I was being ridiculous. He asked for my name. Feeling uneasy, I gave him a fake one. His reaction was immediate. His eyes narrowed, and his tone became harsh. He accused me of lying, insisting he knew my real name was Lucia and that I worked at the diner. The fact that he knew this information made my stomach drop. I was feeling more anxious by the second, desperately trying to think of a way to end this encounter. Then, without warning, he demanded my phone number. I refused, trying to sound firm, but he grabbed my wrist. I yanked my arm away, my heart racing as he reached for me again. He was too close, his hands hovering near me, his stance aggressive. I wanted to run, but I felt frozen in place. Finally, I managed to step away, my heart pounding. I told him I had to go, but as I started to walk away, he called out that he'd walk me home. He said he knew I lived nearby. His words sent a chill through me. My mind was racing. I felt completely stuck. I couldn't exactly run without drawing attention, and if I made a scene, nobody was around to help me at that hour. The streets were empty, the buildings dark, and my apartment was just a few minutes away, but those few minutes suddenly felt like miles. Then, a moment of clarity hit me. The police station. It wasn't far, maybe a 5-minute detour. I made a split-second decision and changed course, but he followed, keeping about 10 feet behind me the entire way. No matter how fast I walked, he stayed right there. I was practically jogging by the time I reached the main road. As I approached the police station, that sinking feeling in my chest started to lift. I had a damn simple plan: find a police officer and get help. The area around the station was well lit, and I could see security cameras on the building. I quickened my pace as I got closer. He was right behind me now, his tone changing from aggressive to confused. He kept asking where we were going. I didn't answer, focusing only on getting to the station. Then I saw them. 2 police officers standing outside the station entrance, deep in conversation. I had never felt so relieved to see the police before. Without hesitation, I called out to them from across the street, my voice shaky but loud. The police officers looked up immediately, clearly sensing something wasn't right. I quickly told them about the man following me, how he knew my name, and how he wouldn't leave me alone. As I spoke, I could feel him behind me, suddenly silent and tense. Then I heard the sound of his footsteps quickening as he turned and began to run away, trying to make his escape. The police officers reacted instantly. One of them quickly crossed the street towards me, while the other turned to chase after him, calling out for him to stop. I spent the next hour giving my statement and arranging for a safe ride home. The officers were kind and supportive, assuring me I had done the right thing by coming to the station. I didn't sleep much that night, too wired from the adrenaline and relief. But I felt safer knowing I had involved the authorities. After that night, I never walked home alone again. I always made sure I had a ride arranged, no matter what. But the wariness hasn't left me, even now. I was driving home late one night, my newly purchased Ferrari California purring beneath me. I just bought it in Miami, a 2010 model. Second-hand, but still my dream car. I couldn't afford a brand new one. But this beauty was more than enough for me. The clock on the dash read 11:30 p.m. as I approached Fort Pierce, just about 15 miles south of my hometown of Vero Beach. The highway stretched empty before me, with only the occasional whoosh of a passing car breaking the silence. Fatigue was setting in after the long drive, my eyes heavy, but I was almost home. I couldn't wait to park this beauty in my garage. As I approached the outskirts of Fort Pierce, flashing blue lights suddenly appeared in my rearview mirror. My heart jumped. I hadn't been speeding, so I was unsure why I was being pulled over. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. Was there something off about the sale? But I quickly dismissed it. The seller had seemed legitimate, and the paperwork was all in order. I signaled and pulled to the side of the road, stopping my car. The lights stopped behind me, and I saw a silhouette step out of the vehicle. The man approached my window. I rolled it down, feeling uneasy. He wore what looked like a police uniform, but in the dim light, I couldn't make out the details clearly. His approach seemed oddly casual for an officer, but I figured it might just be a small-town thing. He demanded my license and registration, his voice gruff. I handed over my documents, my hand shaking slightly. He took them without a word, shining a flashlight in my face. The light was blinding, and I had to look away. I asked him what the problem was, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away, just kept looking at my license. Then he glanced at me, his eyes cold. He told me to step out of the car. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. Something wasn't right. I asked him why, my voice higher than intended. He repeated the command, more forcefully this time. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Every instinct told me not to get out, but I didn't know what else to do. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped out. He moved closer, the flashlight now aimed at my chest. He ordered me to turn around and put my hands on the car. My heart was racing, and I asked what I did wrong. His voice snapped as he told me to just do it. I turned and placed my hands on the roof of the Ferrari, feeling vulnerable and exposed. I heard him moving behind me, the crunch of gravel under his boots. Suddenly, I felt a rough hand grab my wrist, yanking it behind my back. Panic surged through me. I asked what he was doing. He didn't answer, just pulled my other arm back, pinning me against the car. Fear took over, and I struggled, trying to break free. This wasn't right. I begged him to let me go, my voice shaking. He leaned in close, his breath hot on my neck, and told me to shut up. I felt something cold and hard against my wrist. Handcuffs. My heart pounded in my chest as he secured them tightly, the metal biting into my skin. He shoved me aside and got into my Ferrari. I watched helplessly as he started the car, the engine roaring to life. Panic surged through me as I realized this was a robbery. He sped away in my Ferrari, the taillights quickly disappearing into the darkness. I saw the police car begin to move as well. Another figure, an accomplice, was behind the wheel. They made a quick U-turn and sped off in the opposite direction, leaving me alone and handcuffed on the shoulder of the dark highway. Alone and confused, I knew I needed help. Despite the pain from the tight handcuffs, I managed to stumble towards the middle of the road. My heart raced as I saw headlights approaching in the distance. I stood my ground, unable to wave my hands. I just had to hope they would stop. The approaching car slowed, then came to a stop. An older man rolled down his window, his face a mix of concern and caution. I quickly explained my situation, my voice shaking. He hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure whether to trust me. But seeing my distress and the handcuffs, he decided to help. He stepped out of his car and used his cell phone to call 911. As we waited for the police to arrive, he stayed with me, offering words of comfort. I was grateful for his kindness, but couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, still handcuffed and stranded on the dark highway. Time seemed to crawl by. Every sound made me jump, fearing the thieves might return. I kept glancing down the dark highway, hoping to see real police lights. The handcuffs were tight, and my wrists were starting to ache. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the Good Samaritan's reassuring presence as we waited for help to arrive. After what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens in the distance. My heart leaped. Help was coming. But as the sound grew closer, a new fear gripped me. How could I be sure these were real police? I scrutinized the approaching vehicle, looking for any signs that they might be fake. Paranoia had truly set in. A police car pulled up, their lights illuminating the scene. A couple of officers stepped out, approaching me cautiously. I found myself hesitant to trust them, still shaken from the deception. I examined their uniforms and badges closely, looking for any inconsistencies. They asked me if I was okay and began to remove the handcuffs. I winced as the metal scraped against my sore wrists. Once free, I rubbed my wrists, relief washing over me. The officers asked me to recount what had happened. I described the thieves and my stolen Ferrari in detail, hoping it would help them catch them. As I spoke, I realized how easily I'd been tricked. Now, I couldn't help but question every interaction. The real officers noticed my unease and tried to reassure me, but their words did little to calm my nerves. They took my statement and offered to drive me home, but the thought of getting into a police car made my stomach churn. I asked if I could call a friend instead. They agreed, staying with me until my ride arrived. As I waited, I couldn't stop thinking about my stolen Ferrari. It wasn't just a car, it represented years of hard work and saving. The thought of it in the hands of those thieves made me feel violated. The officers promised they would do everything they could to recover it, but I knew the chances were slim. My friend arrived, looking worried. On the ride home, I struggled to explain what had happened to him. The events felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My friend listened patiently, offering words of comfort, but I could tell he was shocked by the story. As we pulled up to my house, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. I was home, safe, but the memory of the night's events lingered. I thanked my friend and walked to my front door. Inside, I methodically checked all the locks, then drew the curtains closed. I knew sleep would be impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the thief's cold stare, felt the bite of the handcuffs. I made a cup of tea with shaking hands and sat in my living room, waiting for the sun to rise, hoping daylight would somehow make things better. In the morning, I called the police station for an update. They hadn't found my car. As I hung up, a thought struck me. The cellar. I hadn't suspected them initially, but now I wondered. I dug out the cellar's number and dialed. A robotic voice informed me the number was disconnected. Strange. I checked my emails for any other contact information, but found nothing. We had met in a shopping center parking lot in Miami to complete the sale. I had no address for them. I called the police back and shared my suspicions. They took the seller's details, but warned me not to get my hopes up. Car theft rings often used fake IDs and burner phones. I spent the next few hours combing through my browser history, trying to find the original ad for the Ferrari. It had been deleted. I searched for similar ads, wondering if the seller was still active. Nothing. The police called back. The seller's ID was fake. They were adding it to their investigation, but advised me to start the insurance claim process. The reality sank in. I might never see my Ferrari again. I opened my laptop to begin the tedious insurance paperwork, my mind racing with unanswered questions about the seller and the fake cop. Were they working together? How long had they planned this? I pushed the thoughts aside. Right now, I needed to focus on the practical steps to move forward. As I began filling out the forms, a bitter realization hit me. I knew the price that I paid for the Ferrari was too good to be true. When I was 15 years old and a sophomore in high school, the most terrifying day of my life happened. It was a typical school day, seemingly no different from any other. I recall sitting in my algebra class, which I believe was the third session of the day. That's when someone arrived at the classroom door with a message. At our school, we had a system where students would assist in the office during certain hours, delivering notifications to other students. These messages were usually about students needing to exit the school for various reasons, such as medical checkups or similar matters. When the student reached my class, they handed the note to my teacher. He read it and then called out my name. I was taken aback because I wasn't expecting any reason to depart from school that day. I pondered if I'd forgotten about a doctor's appointment, but my dad hadn't mentioned anything, and I know he would have. When my name was announced, I glanced around and then stood up, slowly walking to my teacher. He told me to take care and handed me the homework assignment. I took the note, which also functioned as a hall pass, and exited the classroom. I remember that's when I first read the message. It stated something to the effect of, "I'll be there to pick you up for your appointment at 11:15. Dad." I supposed I had some sort of appointment. It just felt a bit odd to me. Still, I guess I was pleased to be leaving school. I strolled through the vacant corridors, making my way to the side entrance. There was a parking area there, which is where students would get picked up by their parents. I reached the doors and stepped outside into the parking lot. There I noticed a car, but it wasn't my father's vehicle. It was a different make and color. I figured it belonged to someone else's parent, and my father wasn't there yet. The time was not quite 11:15, but I think it was around 10 past 11 or so. I don't remember precisely. I stood there scanning the area, waiting for my father to arrive. and then I saw the car that was parked there with the engine running, and the front passenger's window began to lower. I looked and saw a man turn his head and look at me. We made eye contact, and I could tell he was about to speak. The man said he was there to pick me up, and my father had asked him to. He then mentioned that he was a friend of my father. I had never seen this man before in my life, and while I may not have been the sharpest student in the school, I certainly wasn't that naive. I was extremely wary. I asked the man how exactly he knew my father, and he responded by saying they were old acquaintances. I then informed the man that I didn't feel at ease going with him, and I was returning to the school. The man tried to persuade me to just get in the car, but I turned around to head back into the school. This situation was starting to feel really suspicious. The problem was, when I got back to the side doors of the school, they wouldn't budge. The doors were secured. I had forgotten that all entrances to the school were locked during school hours, except for the front main entrance. Then, things deteriorated. I looked back to the car to see the driver's door open. The man emerged and started approaching me. The car was maybe 60 feet away at this point, as I stood right outside of the side doors to the school. I felt like my only choice was to flee. I turned and sprinted around to the front side of the school. I didn't bother to look back at all to see if I was being pursued. Back then, I could run quite swiftly, and fortunately, I made it around to the front end of the school pretty rapidly. I kept running until I reached the front doors, and then I walked inside. When you first entered the front doors at the school, there was a small window where a man sat during school hours. He would inquire who you were, and you had to show him your student ID. He asked for my ID, and as I retrieved it, I attempted to explain what had just occurred. I must not have articulated it very well, though, because he seemed quite perplexed, and to be honest, the whole situation was pretty baffling. I got a hall pass from my father to leave school for an appointment that I didn't know about. Then my father wasn't there, but another man was, and asked me to go with him. Believe me, I was just as confused as he was. After verifying my school ID, the man at the window wrote me a pass to return to my algebra class, and I was on my way. I walked through the empty hallways of the school back to class. This was just about 10 to 20 minutes after I had originally left. I walked back in. My teacher was lecturing, and there was a presentation that was paused on the board. I remember it was incredibly awkward walking into the middle of class. Everybody was staring at me. They, as well as the teacher, were probably all really bewildered seeing me return so soon after I had left. I explained that there had been some confusion, and I didn't need to leave. Then I sat back down at my desk, and the lesson continued. Barely 5 minutes had passed when the intercom suddenly broadcast an announcement. The principal's voice, sounding unusually stern, informed us that we were going into an immediate lockdown. He emphasized that this was not a drill. Our teacher seemed visibly worried as he instructed us to leave our desks and sit quietly on the floor at the back of the classroom. We complied quickly, confusion and concern spreading among us. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, suddenly wondering if this had anything to do with what had just happened to me. The lockdown continued for about 30 minutes. The room was eerily silent, with most of us too anxious to whisper or speculate. Finally, the intercom crackled with another announcement. We all fell silent, straining to hear. The principal's voice, noticeably relieved this time, informed us that the lockdown had been lifted. There was a collective sigh of relief, but the atmosphere remained tense as we slowly returned to our seats. As we were dismissed from class, snippets of information began to circulate. I soon learned the reason for the lockdown. A man had entered the school, completely disregarding the ID check at the front desk. He had pushed past the man at the window without a word and disappeared into the hallways. The staff had no choice but to initiate a lockdown until the intruder could be found. It took the entire duration of the lockdown to locate him. The police were called in, and they eventually found him concealed in a storage closet on the second floor. The most chilling part is that it was the same man who had been in the car trying to pick me up earlier. This incident remains the most terrifying thing to ever happen to me. The man must have somehow created the note for me and tried to get me to leave the school. Who he was and how he found me, I truly have no idea. It really unnerves me to think about that part. Thankfully, nothing like that has ever occurred again. It was 2021, and I had just moved into my first rental home, finally away from my parents' watchful eyes. At 19, I felt like I was on top of the world, ready to take on life's challenges. Little did I know that one quiet evening would shake my newfound independence to its core. I was living the dream, throwing parties on weekends, staying up late to stream Among Us on Twitch, and connecting with fellow gamers from around the world. The rush of live streaming had me hooked, but I was about to learn that, like in Among Us, real danger can hide in plain sight. For a long time, I tried to bury this experience deep in my memory. It's not something I enjoyed revisiting, but recently I've come to realize that hiding from it doesn't help. So I've decided to share my story with you. The first few weeks of living alone were a mix of excitement and anxiety. I reveled in the freedom to eat cereal for dinner and stay up until ungodly hours. Maybe the only downside was that my rental was in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. But it was all I could afford on my meager Walmart wage. I had settled into a routine of sorts. My days were filled with online classes. I was studying computer science at the local community college, but it was the evenings that I lived for. After classes, I'd fire up my computer and start streaming on Twitch. I was playing Among Us, which had exploded in popularity during the pandemic. It isn't the most graphically intensive game, but it is addictive, and it is great for streaming. My channel wasn't massive, but I had about 500 regular viewers. We had inside jokes, emotes, and a sense of community that made me feel less alone in my empty house. I'd stream for hours, losing track of time as I immersed myself in the game and chat with my viewers. That fateful night started like any other. I had just finished a particularly grueling coding assignment and was looking forward to unwinding with my stream. As I set up my equipment, I realized I had left my front door unlocked. In this quiet neighborhood, I hadn't felt the need to be too security conscious. I meant to lock it later, but got distracted and forgot. A mistake I would soon regret more than anything in my life. I had a ritual before every stream, setting the mood with some creepy background noise. I love listening to horror story channels on YouTube, and back then was no different. Prior to the stream, I'd immerse myself in these scary stories. It got me in the right headspace for gaming. Unfortunately, your channel didn't exist at that time, but there were some other great narrators I listened to back then. From horror stories to live gameplay, I switched gears completely. With my headset on, I was in my own little world, completely focused on the tasks at hand and the banter with other players. I thought it was the perfect way to stream. Little did I know, my immersion in the game would isolate me from the real danger lurking in my house. About 2 hours into the stream, things took a turn. While I was lost in the game, oblivious to my surroundings, a real-life nightmare was unfolding just behind me. I was deep into a particularly intense round, trying to figure out who the imposter was. My chat was buzzing with activity, theories flying back and forth. That's when I saw it. A message in the Twitch stream chat that made my blood run cold. "Hey, is that your brother behind you?" I froze. I didn't have a brother, and I was home alone. Then the realization hit me. I was not only home alone, but I had also forgotten to lock the front door. My heart started racing as I grasped what this could mean. Trying to act casual, I glanced at my face cam feed in the corner of my screen. There, in the background, I saw a figure standing in the hallway, behind me. My bedroom door was wide open, giving me a clear view of the intruder. He was massive, at least a foot taller than my measly 5 feet 5 inches frame. Built like Jack Reacher from the TV show, he looked like he could snap me in half without breaking a sweat. But what really sent chills down my spine was the glazed look in his eyes. He seemed high as a kite, swaying slightly as he stood there. In that moment, I knew I couldn't confront him. I was nothing but skin and bones compared to this giant. I had to think fast. The bedroom window was my only escape route. Without a word to my viewers, I yanked off my headset, making a dash for the window. It was already open, a stroke of luck I'm grateful for to this day. As I tumbled out onto the grass, I heard heavy footsteps entering my room. I didn't look back, just ran as fast as my legs could carry me to my neighbor's house. They were an older Asian couple, the Wongs, who'd welcomed me to the neighborhood. Mrs. Wong opened the door, took one look at my terrified face, and ushered me inside. Mr. Wong called the police while I huddled on their couch. By the time the cops arrived, the intruder was long gone. They searched my house but found nothing. No broken windows, no stolen items, not even a single fingerprint. It was as if he was never there. The officers were skeptical at first, probably thinking I was just a young man who was telling tall tales. But when they reviewed the stream footage, they saw the blurry shape in the background, confirming my story. I spent the next few days in a daze. My parents wanted me to move back home, but I stubbornly refused. I wasn't going to let one scary incident rob me of my independence. I took a brief hiatus from streaming. I still have no clue what that man wanted, or why he was in my house. I'm a male model, and this happened a few years ago, while I was working a gig for a sportswear brand. It wasn't my first job, but I'd been doing modeling for a couple of years, while I studied, and had built up a decent portfolio. This particular shoot was at a large studio, and we had a few photographers on set, one of them being Penny. Penny was a freelance photographer who was pretty well known in the industry. She'd done shoots for big fashion labels, so working with her felt like a good opportunity. At first, things were fine. We didn't talk much, but I could tell she was watching me more closely than the other models during the breaks. I didn't think too much of it at first. Being a model, I'm used to people paying attention to how I look, but Penny's gaze was different. She wasn't just checking out my angles, she was looking at me in a way that made me uncomfortable. A few days after the shoot, I got a message from her on Instagram. She mentioned that she had some extra shots from the session that she thought I'd like to see. I didn't think it was odd, as photographers often send me work they want me to check out. So I responded, and she sent over the photos. But then she started messaging me more often. At first, it was still work-related, talking about future shoots, asking me if I was interested in collaborating again. But soon, her messages turned personal. She started asking if I wanted to grab coffee or hang out outside of work. I wasn't interested, but I tried to keep things polite, telling her I was busy. After I declined her invitations a couple of times, Penny's messages took a strange turn. I got a message from her asking why I hadn't left my building yet. That freaked me out, because I hadn't told anyone my plans for the evening. The fact that she knew my movements without any way of knowing was alarming. I started feeling like I was being watched. The next morning, as I was heading to another shoot, I saw her car parked near my apartment building. It was a bright red SUV with oversized tires, easy to spot as I had seen her once, arriving to a shoot in it. The window was open, and I could see she wasn't inside at the time, but it made me uneasy. Later that week, I saw the same car parked down the street while I was grabbing lunch at a spot I usually frequent. I started getting jumpy, checking over my shoulder constantly. It wasn't long before I started receiving calls from a private number. First during the day, then at night. When I answered, there was no response from the other end. Not a word spoken. Just the sound of a woman in the background, pleasing herself, if you know what I mean. After a while, I stopped picking them up, but the missed calls kept piling up. One night, I got home late from a long day of work. As soon as I walked through the door, I heard my phone buzz. It was a message from Penny. The message said that she had seen me at the shoot that day and asked why I didn't wear my new jacket that I usually like to wear. What unsettled me the most was that she wasn't even supposed to be there. She hadn't been hired for that shoot, and no one had mentioned her being around. She'd been there, watching, without me knowing. At that point, I knew it was time to block her on everything, which I did, but it didn't stop the feeling of being constantly watched. Knowing she had telephoto lenses at her disposal didn't help either. For the next few days, things were quiet, and I hoped that maybe she had moved on. Then one evening, as I was driving home from another shoot, I noticed her car again, parked in a lot a block away from the studio. I just ignored it, but the anxiety was building. A few nights later, after a particularly late gig, I walked out to my car and saw Penny standing across the street. She wasn't in her car this time. She was just standing there, staring at me. My heart started racing. As I got closer to my car, she started walking toward me, looking angry, her camera hanging from her neck as if she was about to capture another moment. I got in my car as fast as I could, locking the doors behind me. She stood there, glaring, but didn't come any closer. I drove off, but the entire time, I was watching the rearview mirror, half expecting her to follow. The next day, I went to the police. They couldn't do much without proof, but I filed a report and got a restraining order against her. Since then, I haven't seen or heard from Penny, but the whole experience left me constantly on edge, always wondering if she's still out there, watching from behind her lens. I was driving back from a late-night client visit in rural Arizona, wrapping up my last scheduled call out for the shift at my new 24/7 remote tech support gig. It was 2:45 a.m., and I was using my GPS to navigate the highways back to home. I realized that I was running low on gas, so I searched for the nearest gas station in the Google Maps app and set it as my next stop. It was just a short drive away. About 7 minutes later, I pulled into Love's truck stop, the only gas station for miles. As I headed toward the store, behind where I'd parked the car, I noticed a man getting out of a dark-colored truck a few pumps away, watching me briefly before turning away when I looked his way. I shrugged it off and continued inside to pay for my gas. When I was reaching the queue for the register, that same man entered the store and cut right in front of me in line. He didn't even glance back or acknowledge my presence. I felt a brief flash of irritation, but I wasn't in the mood for confrontation, so I just let it slide. After paying for my gas, I decided to grab some coffee and use the restroom. A couple of minutes later, I returned to my car and began filling up the tank. As I stood there, I saw the man again, now standing by his truck. He was staring directly at me, but this time his eyes lingered longer. I glanced back, trying not to make it obvious that I noticed. Through the gaps between a couple of parked trucks, I caught a glimpse of him making some kind of gesture with his hand, but I couldn't fully see what it was. I hurried to finish the fill-up, got back into my car, and pulled out of the station. My nerves were on edge, and I was beat, and I just wanted to get home and into bed. A few minutes after leaving the gas station, I noticed a vehicle flashing their lights at me. Initially, I thought it might be a signal indicating a police presence in the area, but as I entered a less lit area out of town, I realized my own headlights weren't shining, which was strange, as they were working fine before. I checked the headlight switch, making sure it was in the on position, and sure enough, it was. Perplexed, I pulled over to the side of the road. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out to investigate. That's when I discovered both my headlights were smashed. The thought crossed my mind that the man from the gas station might have intentionally damaged them, purely based on the way he had been acting. But I couldn't be sure. I retrieved my phone and started searching online for roadside assistance. Suddenly, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. I expected to see headlights behind me, but it was just pitch black. The engine cut off, and it was suddenly quiet again. I turned around, shining my flashlight down the road behind me. In the distance, I could just make out the faint reflection of headlights at least 100 yards away, barely visible. I returned to my car and locked the door. I was going to call roadside assistance, but with the truck lingering, I decided to dial 911 instead. Just as I grabbed my phone to make the call, I glanced in the driver's side mirror and noticed a figure walking toward me from the direction of the truck. He was maybe halfway between the truck and my car. In the dim light, it looked like the guy from the gas station, but I couldn't be sure. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered into the phone, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. She asked for more information. As I was speaking to the dispatcher, the driver seemed to reconsider his plans and went back to his truck. I can only speculate as to why, that maybe he saw me on the phone and thought I was calling the police. Moments later, the truck's engine roared back to life, and the truck pulled alongside me. I had the phone pressed to my ear, my heart pounding as the driver rolled down his window. It was definitely him, the guy from the gas station. He stared at me, his eyes locked on mine, and it really freaked me out. Without saying a word, he slowly lifted a gun, waving it just enough for me to see. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear him. But I was almost certain he mouthed, "I'll hunt you down, nerd." Then, with his free hand, he made a slow, deliberate motion across his neck, mimicking the slice of a knife, just to drive his point home. The truck sped away, disappearing into the darkness. I explained to the dispatcher what just happened, and that the man had threatened me. She reassured me that help was almost there. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, and I explained everything to them, about the smashed headlights, the man from the gas station, and the gun threat. They reassured me they'd check the gas station security footage and look into the truck. I contacted roadside assistance, and the police stayed with me until the tow truck arrived. Once everything was sorted, my mom picked me up, and I finally made it home, shaken but safe. A few days later, I heard back from the police. They were able to locate the truck from the gas station security footage, but it had been reported stolen earlier that night. The man had paid cash, and no one at the gas station recognized him. With no further leads or identification, the case seemed to go cold. About 7 years ago, I had started navigating the world of online dating, trying to find something meaningful. Back then, I was pretty active on Tinder, going on dates and hoping to meet the right person. One of those encounters sticks out for all the wrong reasons. It was around 6 years ago when I matched with a woman named Chloe, and what I thought was going to be a great connection quickly turned into one of my worst dating experiences. Chloe's profile stood out from the rest. Unlike many users who barely filled out their information, she had taken the time to create an engaging bio. Her photos were appealing without seeming unrealistic, a refreshing change from the countless fake profiles I'd encountered. Even back then, the problem of fake accounts was prevalent, though I imagine it's only gotten worse since. We connected instantly. Chloe's messages revealed a sharp wit and intelligence, and we discovered we shared many common interests. The chemistry was evident, so we decided to meet up. She proposed a local bar in our city, and despite it being quite far from my place, I eagerly agreed. Anxiety crept in as I arrived at the bar on the day of our date. I scanned the room, looking for a brunette woman with blue eyes among the sparse crowd. Suddenly, there she was, walking through the door. Relief washed over me as I realized she looked exactly like her profile pictures. We exchanged smiles as I approached her, and soon we were seated with drinks in hand. Time seemed to fly by as we chatted. Our conversation felt natural and engaging, as if we'd known each other for years. I couldn't believe how well the date was going, and I found myself getting more excited as we continued to talk and laugh. After a couple of hours of drinks and great conversation, Chloe surprised me with a suggestion. She invited me back to her place to continue our date. The walk to Chloe's place took about 20 minutes, and we kept chatting effortlessly throughout. She lived in a quiet, decent neighborhood, and the house was modest, with a small front yard and simple exterior. Nothing too fancy, but comfortable enough. Inside, the space was cozy, with soft lighting and a comfortable-looking couch where we sat down. Chloe turned on some light music, offered me a beer, and I accepted as we continued our conversation, feeling like the night was going smoothly. Then Chloe suddenly set her drink aside and stood up. With a sly smile, she told me to relax and enjoy what was about to happen, with a teasing look in her eyes. Then, to my surprise, she slowly began unbuttoning her top while moving to the music, which I assumed was the start of a striptease. Just as I was thinking all my Christmases had come at once, the front door suddenly burst open, and a woman in her mid-30s stormed in. She was short but intimidating, with fiery short red hair and a furious expression. At first, I assumed this must be Chloe's friend or roommate. The woman started yelling at Chloe in a language I didn't understand, completely ignoring my presence. Chloe began crying and yelling back in the same language. I sat there, frozen and confused, until the older woman turned to me and switched to English, demanding to know who the hell I was and why I was there alone with Chloe. Before I could even respond, the argument between them escalated quickly, and I was still trying to make sense of what was going on. Suddenly, the woman turned toward me again, furiously declaring that she was Chloe's girlfriend, telling me to leave at once, while pointing at the front door. The moment she said it, everything became crystal clear. There was no need for further explanation. I realized I had just been implanted straight into the middle of their relationship drama. Chloe's girlfriend moved toward me, demanding I hurry up and leave immediately. She then threw open the door, making it absolutely obvious that I should never return and forget the address entirely. Even as I reached the street, I could still hear her shouting insults and expletives at me. I ran down the street until I was sure I wasn't being followed by her angry girlfriend, then called for a ride share to take me home. During the ride, my thoughts swirled in frustration and disbelief. Maybe she wanted to make her girlfriend jealous or stir up more trouble between them. Whatever her reasons, I couldn't shake the feeling of being manipulated. Like I was just a pawn in their drama, with no regard for how it might affect me. Once I was back home, I decided to block Chloe on all platforms and deleted my dating apps. The experience left me wary of online dating for months. In fact, I didn't go on another date, online or otherwise, for almost a year after that incident. When I finally felt ready to try again, I opted for meeting people through mutual friends instead of apps. Ironically, that's how I met my current partner, at a board game night organized by a coworker. I had been working as a rideshare driver to supplement my income for grad school, when one night, a passenger turned a routine drive into something much more seductive and far more dangerous. It was a slow night, but I managed to pick up a few fares. Around 2 a.m., I received a request for a long trip, about 45 minutes away. The fare looked substantial, so I accepted it, feeling stoked about the potential earnings. I drove to the pickup location, a trendy nightclub in the heart of downtown. An attractive young woman stumbled out of the club and into my car. As we began the journey to her destination, a residential area on the outskirts of town, she started to act strangely. She leaned forward, her breath heavy with alcohol, and began to compliment my appearance. I tried to maintain a professional demeanor, focusing on the road. She persisted, her words becoming more explicit and suggestive. The woman slurred her speech, asking personal questions about my relationship status and work schedule. As we continued driving, her behavior escalated. She started to run her hand through her hair, making exaggerated movements to draw attention to herself. I kept my eyes on the road, but in my peripheral vision, I could see her slowly unbuttoning her top. The tension in the car grew palpable as I struggled to maintain my composure. As tempting as it might have been to react or respond, I knew better. I didn't want to risk falling into some sort of trap that could lead to an accusation of unprofessional behavior, or worse, get me banned from the platform while she got a free ride. The woman's advances became more aggressive. She leaned closer, her partially exposed chest now clearly visible. I firmly but politely asked her to sit back and fasten her seatbelt, citing safety concerns. She giggled and complied momentarily, but soon resumed her provocative behavior. About 15 minutes into the ride, she suddenly reached for the steering wheel, claiming she wanted to go on an adventure. I quickly regained control of the vehicle, explaining that we needed to stick to the planned route. She pouted and slumped back in her seat, muttering under her breath. As we passed through a quiet neighborhood, she abruptly demanded that I pull over. Concerned, I asked if she felt ill. She shook her head and insisted she needed to pee. Reluctantly, I stopped at a well-lit gas station. I certainly didn't want her to pee in my car. She stumbled out of the car and disappeared inside the store for several minutes, leaving me anxiously waiting. When she returned, her makeup was noticeably touched up, and she reeked of cheap perfume she must have sprayed on in the store. She climbed back into the car, this time sitting directly behind me. As we resumed our journey, I felt her fingers brushing against the back of my neck, sending uncomfortable shivers down my spine. I cleared my throat and tried to engage her in casual conversation, hoping to diffuse the situation. She responded with increasingly explicit comments about my physical appearance, making me more and more uneasy. I turned up the radio, attempting to drown out her words, but she raised her voice to compete with the music. Halfway through the trip, she began to sob loudly, claiming her boyfriend had cheated on her. Her mood swings were becoming more erratic and unpredictable. I offered her a tissue from the center console, trying to be sympathetic while maintaining my distance. As she took the tissue, her hand lingered on mine for an uncomfortably long moment. The woman's emotional state continued to fluctuate wildly. One minute she was laughing hysterically at something on her phone. The next, she was angrily punching the back of my seat. I considered ending the ride early, but was worried about leaving her stranded in an unfamiliar area in her condition. As we neared her neighborhood, she began describing in graphic detail what she wanted to do with me. I remained silent, hoping my lack of engagement would discourage her. Instead, she reached out and attempted to touch my arm. I shifted away, reiterating the need for her to stay seated. She then started taking selfies, insisting that I should be in them. I declined firmly, explaining that I needed to focus on driving. Undeterred, she leaned forward, trying to angle her phone to capture both of us in the frame. The flash of her camera temporarily blinded me, causing the car to swerve slightly. With about 10 minutes left in the journey, she asked if we could stop at a drive-thru for food. I politely refused, reminding her that the rideshare service was for transportation only. This seemed to anger her, and she began kicking the back of my seat rhythmically, like a petulant child. The last stretch of the ride was tense. She alternated between sullen silence and bursts of flirtatious behavior. She made several attempts to give me her phone number, writing it on a scrap of paper and trying to tuck it into my shirt pocket. I consistently redirected her, keeping my responses short and professional. Finally, we arrived at her address. Relief washed over me as I pulled up to the curb. However, the woman made no move to exit the vehicle. She claimed she was too drunk to walk and needed help getting inside. Her tone was pleading, but there was an underlying note that felt off. Instead of getting out of the car, she sat there in the back seat, adjusting herself in a way that left little to the imagination. Her legs parted under the barely there miniskirt. She made no effort to hide her intentions. I had to fight every urge to keep my focus, reminding myself to stay professional. This was a test of my self-control. She asked again if I could walk her to the door. I politely declined. Instead, I offered to call a friend or family member for her instead. She became insistent, her demeanor shifting rapidly between flirtatious and desperate. As I held firm in my refusal, her act began to crumble. Her eyes looked around nervously, and she fumbled with her phone. Finally accepting that I wouldn't enter her home, she reluctantly stumbled out of the car. Being the gentleman I am, I waited and watched as she unsteadily made her way to her front door, fumbling with her keys before managing to let herself in. As soon as I saw she was safely inside, I drove away, relieved the ordeal was over. Once I was a safe distance from the house, I pulled over and reported the incident to the rideshare company. The next day, I received a call from the police. They informed me that the woman had filed a complaint, accusing me of making unwanted advances and threatening her during the ride. I was shocked by the false accusation and recounted my version of events of being harassed. The police seemed frustrated by the conflicting stories and lack of evidence. They explained that without corroboration, neither account could be verified or acted upon. If this was the result of staying professional, I was horrified to think what might have happened if I had fallen for her advances. The incident left me shaken and wary. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped a carefully planned trap, one that could have had severe consequences for my reputation and future. It was late, around 2 a.m., when I decided to stop at a remote gas station near Bozeman, Montana. I had been driving for hours, and my tank was running low. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. The place looked old and run down, but I didn't have much choice. I pulled up to the pump in my Audi A3, swiped my card at the pump, and started to fill the tank. The air was still, and the only sound was the hum of the gas pump. I glanced around, feeling a bit uneasy. There were no other cars, and the station seemed deserted. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. As I finished pumping the gas, the door to the small convenience store opened. Two men stepped out, both wearing jeans and dark jackets. They looked at me with cold, assessing eyes. They were closely followed by a woman in dark clothing. I tried to smile and nod, but they didn't respond. Instead, they walked over, stopping a few feet away from me. One of the men spoke, his voice low and gravelly, telling me we had a problem. I responded, trying to keep my voice steady, saying I was just getting gas. The taller man, more muscular, leaned against the pump, blocking my way back to the car. I had lost sight of the woman. I had no idea at that time if she was with them or not. The first man looked me up and down, then smirked. He commented that with a fancy car like mine, I must be a long way from home. A knot formed in my stomach. I told him I was just passing through, hoping to end the conversation quickly. The tall man chuckled, asking if I was lost. I insisted that I just needed to get back on the road. His eyes narrowed, noting that not many people like me come through at this time of night. Finally, the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. I reached for the nozzle, but the first man stepped closer, blocking my path. His tone turned menacing as he said we had an issue. I frowned, confused, and asked him what he meant, trying to keep my voice steady. He smirked, glancing at his partner, and explained that I needed to hand over my wallet. Nice and easy. I hesitated, my heart racing. I glanced around, hoping to see another customer or any sign of help, but the station remained deserted. The tall man moved closer, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. He noted my hesitation, his voice turning darker. He suggested that if I didn't want to hand over my wallet, maybe we could work something out. My pulse quickened. I told them I needed to get going, edging toward my car. But the first man grabbed my arm, his grip tight. He told me I wasn't going anywhere. Panic set in, and I yanked my arm free, adrenaline surging through me. I shouted at them to get out of my way. The tall man pulled out a knife. He told me, in a deadly serious voice, that I should listen to his friend. My heart raced. I glanced around, looking for a way out. The store was too far, and my car was blocked by them. I had to think fast. I told them okay, and to just take what they wanted, raising my hands in surrender. The first man smirked, reaching for my wallet. Before he could grab it, I yanked the gas nozzle out of the car and swung it, hitting him hard in the face. He stumbled back, cursing. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted toward my car, yanking the door open. The tall man lunged at me, but I slammed the door shut, locking it just in time. He pounded on the window, shouting obscenities. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to start. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as I sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I saw the two men running after me. After a few minutes of driving, I started to relax, thinking I had escaped. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Suddenly, a figure sat up in the back seat. It was a woman who had been lying flat and hidden beneath a dark blanket. It was the woman who followed the two men out of the small convenience store. She told me to keep driving. My blood ran cold as I realized the night's horrors weren't over yet. She said she was armed. She pulled out a gun to prove it. I nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady. The woman leaned forward. She told me to take the next exit. I complied, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. As we drove, my mind raced, trying to piece together how she'd gotten into my car. Then it hit me. She must have slipped in while I was distracted at the pump, fighting off those two men. She directed me onto a dirt road. The car bounced and shuddered as we made our way deeper into the woods. She ordered me to stop. I cut the engine, the sudden silence deafening. She got out, walking around to my door. I sat, frozen, as she opened it. She gestured for me to get out. I did, my legs shaky. She pointed to the woods with her gun, telling me to start walking. I hesitated. I raised my hands, fear coursing through me. I started walking, leaves crunching under my feet. After a few minutes, she told me to stop and turn around. I did, expecting the worst. She told me to toss her my phone, wallet, and car keys. I did. But she just stood there, gun lowered. She told me she was sorry, that they just wanted my possessions and didn't want to harm me. Then she turned and walked away. I stood there, stunned, until the sound of my car starting jolted me back to reality. I watched as my taillights faded into the distance. I was alone in the woods, miles from anywhere, with nothing. But I was alive. I walked along the dirt road for about 40 minutes. The night was still dark when I spotted a small farmhouse set back from the road. Exhausted, I stumbled up the driveway and knocked on the front door. After a pause, the door cracked open. A burly man with a thick beard peered out, shotgun in hand. I quickly explained my situation, hands raised. His expression softened, and he lowered the gun. He invited me inside and called the police. Within 30 minutes, a deputy arrived to take my statement. As I recounted the night's events, I felt the adrenaline finally wearing off. The fear and exhaustion hit me all at once. The deputy assured me they'd do everything they could to find the suspects and my stolen car. The farmer offered me his couch to rest. I gratefully accepted, knowing the ordeal was over, but that the memory would stay with me for a long time to come. This was the scariest day of my life. I was in 11th grade. It was a normal Tuesday, and I was sitting in chemistry class before lunch. Our teacher was going on about molecular structures or something, but I wasn't really paying much attention. I was more focused on the clock, counting down the minutes until lunch. Suddenly, the intercom came to life. Usually, announcements came at the beginning or end of the day, so this was unusual. The principal's voice came through, sounding tense. He told us we were going into an immediate lockdown and that this was not a drill. My heart started racing. Our teacher quickly locked the door and told us to get away from the windows. We huddled in the corner of the room, trying to stay quiet. Nobody knew what was going on, but you could feel the fear in the air. Some of my classmates were whispering, asking if anyone knew anything. I checked my phone, but there were no messages or news alerts. Minutes felt like hours as we sat there in silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The girl next to me was shaking, and I noticed a few others were silently crying. Our teacher kept glancing at the door, his face pale and worried. After about 15 minutes, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, slow footsteps. The footsteps stopped right outside our classroom door. We all held our breath. The door handle jiggled. Once, twice. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I grabbed the hand of the person next to me, not even sure who it was. The handle jiggled again, more forcefully this time. After a while, the footsteps moved on. I could hear a few of my classmates quietly sobbing. We sat there, frozen in fear. Every little sound made us jump. The tick of the clock on the wall, the muffled sobs of my classmates, the distant sound of sirens growing louder. Another 20 minutes passed in tense silence. Then, we heard more footsteps. Multiple sets moving quickly. Voices, too. I thought at the time that it was probably police officers. One of them tried our door, then moved on when they found it locked. A few minutes later, the intercom came on again. The principal announced that the lockdown was over and that we should remain in our classrooms until further instructions were given. There was a collective sigh of relief, but the tension didn't fully dissipate. Our teacher tried to calm us down, saying everything was okay now. But his voice was shaky, and I could tell he was just as scared as we were. Some of my classmates started to talk, their voices a mix of fear and relief. Others just sat there, still in shock. About 30 minutes later, we were told to evacuate the building. As we filed out, I saw police officers everywhere. They were in the hallways, classrooms, even on the roof. Their presence was both reassuring and terrifying. What had happened to require so many officers? They directed us to the football field, where we sat in the bleachers while they took attendance, and parents started arriving to pick up their kids. The sun was bright, a stark contrast to the darkness of fear we'd just experienced inside. That's when the rumors started flying. Someone said they saw a man with a gun. Another person claimed there were multiple intruders. A girl in my math class swore she heard gunshots, but I hadn't heard anything like that. Everyone had a different story, and it was hard to know what to believe. I saw some of my friends from other classes and waved them over. We huddled together, sharing our experiences. My friend Jake said he'd been in the bathroom when the lockdown was announced. He'd had to hide in a stall, his feet up on the toilet so no one could see him. The fear in his eyes as he told the story made it all feel real again. As we sat on the bleachers, I noticed a commotion near the school building. Several police officers were escorting a man in handcuffs. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. The man looked around wildly as they led him to a police car. For a moment, his eyes seemed to lock with mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Who was he? What had he been planning to do? The principal came to address us, his face grim. He explained that an armed man had entered the school, but had been apprehended without any shots fired. We were all to go home for the day, and school would be closed tomorrow. As I waited for my parents to pick me up, I couldn't shake the image of that man. Had he really been right outside our classroom door? What would have happened if he'd managed to get in? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. I saw some teachers huddled together, talking in low voices. They looked shaken, and I realized they must have been just as scared as we were. Our chemistry teacher was among them, and when he saw me looking, he gave a weak smile and a nod. My parents finally arrived, looking frantic. They rushed over and hugged me tightly. I could see other parents doing the same with their kids. Some were crying, others looked angry, demanding answers from any school official they could find. As we walked to the car, I took one last look at the school. Police tape was everywhere, and officers were still going in and out. It looked like a scene from a crime show, not the place where I'd spent the last 3 years of my life. The day that had started so normally had turned into something out of a nightmare. As we drove home, I knew it would be a long time before any of us felt truly safe at school again. This story is about one of the scariest things that ever happened to me when I was younger. It was back in 2016, and I was 14 at the time. I live in Honolulu, Hawaii. A real paradise, you'd think. And most of the time, it is. My mom had passed away 2 years before, so it was just me and my dad. He worked a lot, trying to keep things together for us, I guess. That meant I was home alone pretty often. Usually, it wasn't a big deal. I'd do my homework, watch TV, normal kid stuff. This one evening, my dad was out late at work. I was in the living room, probably watching some show I can't even remember now, when the doorbell rang. At first, I ignored it. Dad always told me not to answer the door when I was alone. But then it rang again, and curiosity got the better of me. I went to the front window and peeked out. There was a woman standing on our porch. When she saw me, she smiled and waved. She started talking through the door, introducing herself as a friend of my dad's. She even mentioned my dad's name, Jacob. She explained that he'd asked her to come over and look after me, maybe take me out for some food while we waited for him. The way she spoke, it sounded like she and my dad were more than just friends. I felt all confused. Part of me was excited at the idea of my dad having a girlfriend. I mean, it had been 2 years since Mom died, and I wanted him to be happy. But something felt off. Dad had never mentioned her before, and he always told me if someone was coming over. The woman kept talking, saying how they'd been planning to introduce us properly, but this was a chance for us to get to know each other casually first. She sounded so nice, so convincing. I don't know what came over me, but I found myself unlocking the door. Maybe it was the loneliness, or the idea that my dad had finally found someone after Mom passed. Whatever it was, I opened that door, and she stepped inside with a warm smile. As she entered, she looked around our living room, commenting on how cozy it was. Then she suggested we go out for ice cream while waiting for my dad. The idea sounded great, and I was about to agree when she suddenly stopped and stared at a photo on our mantel. It was a picture of my mom, Dad, and me at the beach, taken just a few months before Mom passed away. The woman picked up the frame, studying it closely. She turned back to me with a smile. She suggested I grab a jacket before we left, as it might get chilly later. I nodded and headed to my room to get a hoodie. As I was pulling it out of my closet, my phone rang in my pocket. It was my dad calling, thinking he was probably checking in or letting me know about his friend coming over and when he'd be home. I answered the call, and I told him about his girlfriend being there and how we were going to get ice cream. I even remember telling him that I approved of her. There was a long pause on the other end. When my dad finally spoke, his voice was tense, almost scary. He told me very firmly that he didn't have a girlfriend. He instructed me to go to the bathroom right away, lock the door, and stay there. He said he was calling the police and would be home as fast as he could. We quickly said goodbye and hung up. My blood ran cold. The woman, who had been in the other room, called out asking who was on the phone. She must have heard the ring. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had to stay calm. I had to lie. I told her it was just a friend from school. Then I asked if I could use the bathroom quickly before we left, making up an excuse about drinking too much soda earlier. She laughed and said, of course. I walked to the bathroom, trying not to run. As soon as I was inside, I locked the door and slid down to the floor. My whole body was shaking. I could hear her moving around in the living room, probably wondering what was taking me so long. After a few minutes, she knocked on the bathroom door. She asked if I was okay, her voice sounding concerned. I lied again, saying I wasn't feeling well and might need a few more minutes. She said that was fine, but I could tell she was getting impatient. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I sat there on the cold tile floor, straining my ears for any sound. I heard her footsteps pacing back and forth. She knocked again. She said we needed to leave soon if we wanted to get ice cream before my dad arrived. This time her voice less friendly. I was running out of excuses. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. That's when I heard another sound. Car doors slamming outside. The woman must have heard it too, because suddenly everything went quiet. Then there was a loud bang. Someone kicking in our front door. I heard shouts of police and the sound of heavy footsteps. The woman yelled something I couldn't make out, and then more shouting, and a crash. A few moments later, there was a gentle knock on the bathroom door. A woman's voice. Not the fake girlfriend, but a police officer. She was telling me that it was safe to come out. When I opened the door, the house was full of police officers. And shortly afterwards, my dad walked in, looking more scared than I'd ever seen him. It turned out the woman was working for a human trafficking operation. They'd been watching our house, learning our routines. If my dad hadn't called when he did, well, I don't like to think about what might have happened to me. Later, we found out how the woman had gotten my dad's name. She had found it on a utility bill in our mailbox. That night changed a lot for me and my dad. For months after, I struggled with anxiety and had trouble sleeping. As time passed, things slowly got back to normal. You know, Hawaii is still beautiful, and most days it feels like paradise. But now and then, when I'm walking on the beach or watching the sunset, I remember that night. It's just part of my story now, part of what made me who I am today. I'm 30 now, but this happened 5 years ago when I was 25 and finishing up my master's degree. My lease on the small rental house was ending soon, but I decided to stay until it expired, a choice I'd come to regret. The house layout is important to picture. You enter through a side door into a small mudroom. From there, a narrow hallway leads to the main living area. The living room has large windows overlooking the backyard, and a sliding glass door opens onto a modest wooden deck. My next-door neighbors were a middle-aged couple who'd lived there for years. We rarely spoke, so I had no idea what I was in for. Everything started the evening I brought home my new puppy. I was on the deck, watching him explore the yard while chatting with my sister on the phone. Suddenly, I felt someone's presence and smelled cigarette smoke. I turned to find a young man leaning over the fence that divided our 2 yards. I jumped, startled, and ended the call with my sister abruptly. The young man introduced himself as Chad, the son of my next-door neighbors, and tried to shake my hand. I responded with a nervous greeting. He commented on my puppy, and I thanked him awkwardly. Then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he was gone. I hurried inside with my puppy, locking the door behind me. The next morning, as I left for work, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It contained a flirtatious message and an invitation for coffee, signed by Chad. He'd also scrawled, "See you soon, kitten," at the bottom, which made my skin crawl. I crumpled up the note and tossed it in my car, feeling unsettled. That evening, I was in my bedroom grading papers when I heard shouting from next door. Chad's voice carried clearly through the thin walls, yelling at his parents about money. Then I heard him make a terrifying threat, which basically involved burning down their house. His words sent a chill down my spine. The argument ended with a door slamming, followed by heavy footsteps on the deck next door. The smell of cigarettes wafted through my open window. I closed it quickly, but sleep eluded me that night. Around 2 a.m., I got up to use the bathroom. As I walked down the hallway, I heard Chad's voice from outside calling,
"Where are you going, kitten?"
I froze, then hurried to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. Being young and naive, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The next morning, I woke to a cool breeze. Confused, I found the sliding door to the deck wide open. On my kitchen counter was another note. With shaking hands, I read Chad's messy scrawl, expressing his belief that we were destined to be together. Throughout the day, I jumped at every sound. That night, while talking to my sister again, I heard running footsteps outside and someone pounding on my walls. I told her what was happening, and she urged me to call the police. Instead, I stood frozen by my front door as Chad hammered on it, shouting my name. After what felt like hours, it stopped. Relieved, I waited a minute, listening for any more sounds. When everything seemed quiet, I turned back towards the living room and saw Chad standing there, having climbed over the deck railing and come in through the sliding door. He questioned why I had ignored him, his voice cold. I lied, saying I had been in the shower. He stared at me for a long moment, then climbed back out and left. Shaken by this intrusion, I immediately called a 24-hour locksmith. They came within the hour and installed a new, more secure lock on the sliding door. I also asked them to check all the other locks in the house. It was expensive, but I felt it was necessary for my safety. I covered the bills myself, didn't want to wait for approval from the landlord. Despite the new locks, this wasn't the last incident. Over the next week, I'd often come home to find things on the deck slightly out of place, though I couldn't be sure if anything was actually missing. I'd hear strange noises at night, like someone trying to jimmy the sliding door lock. Once, I even found muddy footprints on the deck, stopping right at the newly secured sliding door. It was clear Chad was still trying to get in, but thankfully, the new locks were holding. A week later, my lease ended. When I spoke to my landlord about the incidents, he was shocked. He revealed that he actually also owned the neighboring house, and he'd only rented it to the middle-aged couple, and wasn't aware that their son Chad was living there too. Apparently the lease for that property also only allowed for 2 adult occupants. My landlord promised to address the issue with them, but I'd had enough. I moved out immediately. A month later, my former landlord called to tell me a young couple had moved into my old place. Chad had broken in multiple times, leaving threatening notes and personal items behind. He'd even set small fires in the backyard. It was a stark reminder of how dangerous the situation could have been. So Chad, wherever you are now, let's never cross paths again. When I was 20, back in 1992, I was driving from Seattle to my college in San Francisco. I had just finished visiting my sister in Seattle and decided to make the long drive, half over that night. I was in my Honda Civic that I'd had since high school, reliable but not exactly a speed demon. Around 11 p.m., I found myself on a quiet stretch of I-5 in Northern California. The night was clear, but the road was dark and lonely. Everything seemed normal until I stopped at a 24-hour gas station just past Redding. As I pulled back onto the highway, a black SUV suddenly appeared behind me and started following. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after an hour, I realized it was still there. The SUV had tinted windows and a large dent in the front bumper. I could make out two figures in the front seats, a woman driving and a man in the passenger seat. As the SUV continued to follow me, my mind raced through various scenarios. Was this just some aggressive driver or something worse? I gripped the steering wheel tighter, acutely aware of how vulnerable I felt as a young woman alone on this dark stretch of highway. The longer this went on, the more my unease grew. I tried to shake off these thoughts and focus on the immediate problem. Right now, I just needed to figure out how to shake this SUV, regardless of who was driving it or why they were following me. I started to get nervous. The SUV would sometimes fall back, then suddenly appear right on my bumper, so close I couldn't see its headlights. I tried speeding up, but my little Civic could only go so fast. Even when I pushed it to 90 miles per hour, the SUV kept pace effortlessly. This cat-and-mouse game continued for many, many miles. Terrified, I scanned desperately for a police car but saw none. I didn't dare exit, afraid they would follow. The highway was eerily empty, and I felt completely alone. I had my Chihuahua, Frankie, in his carrier on the passenger seat, but he was more scared than I was. I realized my only advantage might be fuel efficiency. I prayed my Civic's full tank would outlast their gas-guzzling SUV. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed the SUV starting to fall behind. Eventually, it disappeared from my rearview mirror, maybe tired of the game or something else entirely. I drove on for another hour, shaking with relief and leftover adrenaline. To this day, I don't know what those people wanted, but the memory of that night still sends chills down my spine. Needless to say, I never drove through the night alone again. I met this guy called Joshua on Tinder. Joshua had a charming and witty way with words, making our online connection feel effortless. In person, he was tall and lean, with curly brown hair and a relaxed smile that put me at ease, just like he looked on his profile. Good first sign, or so I thought. We'd been chatting for about a week when Joshua suggested meeting up. Our first date was at a bar in downtown Houston. The conversation flowed, and I found myself drawn to his quick wit and stories. By the end of the night, I wanted to see him again. A few days later, Joshua asked for a second date. He said his car was at the mechanic's and asked if I could pick him up. I agreed, thinking it was a chance to return the favor since he'd driven last time. On Saturday night, I pulled up to Joshua's apartment complex. He came out looking even more handsome than I remembered. We decided to try a new restaurant on the outskirts of the city. Dinner was great, full of laughter and stories. As we left, the streets were nearly empty. I turned onto a main road, heading back to Joshua's place. That's when I noticed the car behind us. It was following closely, almost bumper to bumper. I switched lanes, thinking they'd pass, but they stayed right on our tail. I commented on how close the car was driving. Joshua turned to look and suggested maybe they thought I'd cut them off at the last intersection. I didn't remember cutting anyone off, but it was possible I hadn't seen them in the dark. I switched lanes again, hoping they'd go around, but they matched my move. I expressed my confusion about the driver's behavior. Joshua suggested turning down a side street to see if they'd follow. I did, and the car was still behind us. My heart raced. I took another turn, then another, trying to shake them off. But no matter where we went, the car stayed right behind us. I told Joshua that I was scared and asked him what I should do. He suggested finding a well-lit area to pull over so he could talk to them. I hesitated, questioning if it was safe. Joshua assured me he could handle himself and told me to stay in the car and lock the doors. I spotted a well-lit stretch of road with a wide shoulder and pulled over. The other car stopped right behind us. Before Joshua could get out, the driver of the other car jumped out. In my side mirror, I saw him clearly under the streetlights. A stocky man with a shaved head, looking angry. Joshua got out of the car, telling me to stay put. I watched in the mirrors as Joshua approached the man. They started arguing, their voices raised but too muffled for me to hear. Suddenly, the bald man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small knife. I reached for my phone to call 911, but before I could, Joshua moved quickly. He knocked the knife from the man's hand and followed up with a series of strikes. The man stumbled back, clearly outmatched. Within seconds, Joshua had him on the ground and kicked the knife far away, like you see in the movies. The whole thing was over in less than a minute. Joshua left the man on the ground and calmly walked back to my car, as if it was nothing. He got in without looking back. The man struggled to his feet and stumbled back to his car, then drove off. I asked if he was okay. Joshua said he was fine and that the man wouldn't bother us again. When I asked how he did that, Joshua explained he had extensive martial arts training. I drove Joshua home, still processing what had happened. He acted like it was no big deal. When I dropped him off, he gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and said he'd call me soon. The next few days passed quickly. I was supposed to head out on a business trip, so when Joshua texted a couple of times asking how I was doing and if we could meet up, I told him I was fine and we'd get together again once I returned. He seemed understanding and said he was looking forward to it. However, just as I was about to leave, my trip got canceled at the last minute. I figured I'd surprise Joshua later that day and catch up with him sooner than expected. But before I had the chance to tell him, something strange happened. That afternoon, I stopped to grab a coffee near my work. And as I walked in, I saw them. Joshua sitting at a corner table, laughing and chatting with the bald man from the other night. They looked like old friends, deep in conversation, and it made me freeze in my tracks. I realized the whole thing had been staged. The road rage, the confrontation, all of it. Joshua had set it up to look like a hero. I left without being seen, my mind racing. I wondered why someone would go to such lengths to impress a date, and what else Joshua had lied about. At home, I blocked Joshua's number and unmatched him on Tinder. I briefly considered reporting him, but didn't know what to say. It sounded unbelievable, even to me. In the end, I viewed it as a strange and unsettling experience. I'd been working the graveyard shift at a small rural 24-hour diner for about 10 months. The job was mind-numbing, but it gave me a chance to study during the quiet hours, which helped with my online classes. The hours crawled by, and the work was monotonous. I'd often contemplated finding new employment, and the events of that night pushed me to my breaking point. It started as just another ordinary shift at the diner. I'd finished wiping down the tables and restocking the condiments when I noticed the headlights of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot. It was a beat-up van with tinted windows that obscured the interior. As the van parked, I observed a lone occupant exiting. A woman, appearing to be in her late 40s, stepped out and approached the entrance. She had graying hair and wore a threadbare denim jacket. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. I greeted her with a smile and asked if she needed a menu. She didn't respond, just placed a $10 bill on the counter and headed to a booth. It was somewhat rude, but not uncommon in a late-night diner, especially when patrons are too tired for small talk. From behind the counter, I watched her sitting in the booth, but she seemed to be taking an unusually long time to order. She'd only left enough money for a simple meal, so she should have decided quickly. After several minutes, I approached to take her order, but she abruptly stood up and walked out of the diner. I figured she had just changed her mind, so I dismissed it and went back to my tasks, unaware that she hadn't actually left the parking lot. What I didn't realize at the time was that she had been casing the place, making sure no one else was around. As the night progressed, however, I couldn't shake an unsettling feeling. I can't quite put into words the unease that crept over me that night. There were no other customers coming in, and an eerie silence enveloped the place. Then, I heard a noise from the kitchen area. It sounded like a pan falling off a shelf. I was mopping the floor at the time this all happened, as there were no customers around, so I kept hold of the mop and cautiously made my way towards the kitchen. As I entered, I found a man there, rummaging through our supplies. He was stocky and unkempt, looking like he hadn't showered in days. I froze, paralyzed with fear, unsure how to react. The man turned and spotted me. We locked eyes for a moment. Then he began advancing towards me, his gaze never wavering. I backed away slowly, raising my hands in a placating gesture, but he kept coming. The stench of cheap liquor wafted from him, and I sensed he was volatile. He slurred, demanding to know where we kept the cash. In one hand, he clutched a broken bottle. Seeing him intoxicated and armed, I was terrified. I gestured towards the register, and he shoved me in that direction. As I opened the till, the man wandered around the diner, focusing on the dessert display. He stuffed several whole pies into a duffel bag before returning to the counter. I laid out all the money we had, barely over $200. The man looked at the cash, then at me, clearly dissatisfied with the amount. He insisted there must be more, but we simply didn't have it. He brandished the broken bottle, yelling incoherently. I thought he might lunge at me, but suddenly he snatched the money and bolted out the door. My heart raced as I watched through the window. He jumped into the same dilapidated van from earlier. The woman was at the wheel, and they sped off. The police arrived shortly after, responding to the silent alarm I'd triggered while the man was grabbing pies. Initially, the police seemed skeptical. Fortunately, our parking lot cameras had captured the van's license plate. A week later, I learned both suspects had been apprehended. They were transients who'd been living in the stolen van, robbing small businesses primarily for food and cash. I was fortunate to escape unharmed, given that their erratic behavior had left an employee at another diner with severe injuries. Within a month, I'd resigned and secured a day job elsewhere. When this harrowing experience took place, I had just turned 18 and was making a solo drive from Portland to Salem, Oregon. My boyfriend and I had planned to visit his mother, who lived on the outskirts of Salem, for a long weekend. He was coming from Eugene, where he attended college, so we agreed to meet at his mom's place. It was mid-autumn, so darkness fell early. I set out from Portland around 8:30 p.m., anticipating a 70-minute journey. By 9 o'clock, I was still about 30 to 40 minutes from my boyfriend's mom's house, and I was trying to maintain a sense of calm and confidence. It's not that I had any specific premonition, but being a young woman driving alone, I couldn't help but have some concerns lurking in the back of my mind. The usual I-5 route was blocked by a major accident, so my GPS redirected me down a series of back roads. As I turned onto a poorly lit country road, I felt eerily isolated. I didn't particularly enjoy the sensation of being completely alone out there, but I did my best to push those thoughts aside reminding myself that I'd reach my destination before long. I had traveled the usual route many times before without incident, so I hoped the detour would be the same. How wrong I was. I was about 20 minutes from the house when I noticed some flashing lights in the distance. As I got closer, I could make out two blinking yellow lights in the middle of the road, which I quickly identified as hazard lights on a vehicle. An uneasy feeling began to creep over me, and I didn't like that the car wasn't pulled over to the shoulder, but instead was blocking the center of the road. I came to a stop about 60 feet away and started to contemplate my next move. One thing was certain. There was no way I was going to stop and offer assistance. I mean, I was barely 18, alone on a dark country road. It would be absolutely reckless to stop for anyone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, still unsure of what to do. I had no cell service, so calling my boyfriend or his mom wasn't an option. I finally decided to turn around and head back until I got cell service to call my boyfriend and discuss the situation. I briefly considered whether or not I should also try to call for assistance for the folks ahead, but then realized they might have already done so. There was no way for me to know without approaching them, which I wasn't comfortable doing. I'm sure any other young woman in my situation would feel the same way. You have to prioritize your own safety over that of strangers. Always. The problem was that it was a narrow 2-lane road, and it would take more than a simple 3-point turn to reverse direction. As I hesitated, I glanced in my rearview mirror and noticed some shadows rapidly approaching my car from behind. I could barely make them out in the moonlight. As I sat there, still unsure what to do, the movement in my rearview mirror became clearer. They were moving quickly, heading straight for my car. Panic surged through me as I spotted something in their hands. Baseball bats. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. My body took over before my mind could catch up. I yanked the gear shift into drive and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. My little car lurched forward. I swerved around the stopped vehicle, my tires screeching as they hit the gravel on the shoulder. As I passed the other car, its doors suddenly flew open. More people spilled out, their faces hidden in the shadows. One of them reached out, trying to grab my side mirror. I jerked the wheel, narrowly avoiding their grasp. A loud thud echoed through the car as something hit my rear window. Cracks spiderwebbed across the glass, but it held together. I heard shouting behind me, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of my pounding heart. I kept my foot pressed firmly on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb higher and higher. The road ahead was dark and winding, but I didn't dare slow down. Every few seconds, I glanced in my rearview mirror, my heart racing. At times, I thought I could see pinpricks of light far in the distance behind me, but I couldn't be sure if they were headlights. The dark, winding road made it hard to tell for certain if I was being followed. I drove like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I could feel tears streaming down my face. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I just needed to get as far away from there as possible. I finally reached my boyfriend's mom's street, feeling utterly drained. My boyfriend's mom came out to meet me. She hugged me and quickly led me inside, asking if I was okay. Once we were in the house, she helped me settle down and gently encouraged me to explain what had happened. After taking a moment to collect myself, I began to tell her about the frightening experience I'd just been through. She kept asking if they had followed me there, and honestly, I had no idea. My boyfriend's mom is serious about security. She has multiple security cameras around her property. She checked the footage and noticed the same car passing by the front gate repeatedly, as if it was driving down the street, turning around and coming back multiple times. We decided it was time to call the police. The dispatcher said they would send officers to take our statement and patrol the area. However, given that the incident occurred outside their jurisdiction, they explained they'd also need to coordinate with the county sheriff's department. My boyfriend's mom was visibly frustrated by the jurisdictional complications. She asked what could be done immediately. The dispatcher advised us to stay inside, keep doors and windows locked, and call back if we saw any suspicious activity. They also said they'd alert neighboring law enforcement agencies about the incident, in case the suspects were still in the area. My boyfriend's mom thanked them, but emphasized her intention to protect her home and family if necessary. The dispatcher acknowledged this, and that was the end of the conversation. She armed herself and told me to wait inside the house. She called my boyfriend, who was still about 45 minutes away, and went outside to check the property. I watched the security cameras as my boyfriend's mom checked the property. Suddenly, a car slowly approached and came to a stop right at the edge of the driveway. Two people got out, apparently not noticing my boyfriend's mom, who was already walking towards them. They tried pushing the gate open, and because I couldn't hear what was happening, all I saw was my boyfriend's mom run up to them and fire a warning shot into the air. I could tell she was yelling something at them, but I couldn't make out what. They scrambled back into their car and sped off quickly. We weren't sure if they'd return, but I had a feeling that was the end of it. My boyfriend arrived about 45 minutes later and kept apologizing profusely for having me drive alone. But I assured him it wasn't his fault, and the outcome might have been the same, even if he had been with me. We were safe, and that's what mattered most. I'm a high school physics teacher with a classroom on the ground floor. My room is filled with various experiments and demonstrations to engage students in the wonders of science. From pendulums to circuit boards, every corner is designed to spark curiosity. I find great joy in helping teenagers grasp complex concepts and see the world through the lens of physics. It was a chilly Wednesday morning during second period. I had a free block and was using the time to set up a pendulum experiment for my next class. The halls were quiet, with most students settled into their classrooms. Around 9:45 a.m., the intercom came to life, announcing we were going into lockdown. The principal instructed all staff and students to follow lockdown procedures immediately. My heart skipped a beat as I processed the information. Following protocol, I immediately locked the door and turned off the lights. I'd already lowered the blinds earlier to block out the glare on the smartboard, which now seemed like a fortunate coincidence. As silence fell over the school, I wondered about the cause of the lockdown, hoping everyone was safe. I moved quietly to my desk in the far corner of the room, trying to make sense of the situation. Were we dealing with an external threat? Or was it something within the school? The uncertainty was unsettling. For several minutes, nothing seemed amiss. The silence was almost oppressive. Then, as I sat at my desk, I heard a faint sound. It was barely perceptible at first, but it grew clearer. Something was happening outside. Cautiously, I moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the blinds. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was movement in the parking lot. A figure was moving between cars, clearly trying to stay hidden. They moved from one vehicle to another, always keeping in the shadows. My heart rate picked up as I realized this could be the reason for our lockdown. The person appeared to be an adult, likely male, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the shadows. As I watched, he made his way towards the school building. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered something crucial. In my rush to start setting up the experiment, I'd cracked open one of the windows for some fresh air. It was on the opposite side of the room, and I knew I couldn't risk crossing the space to close it now. The open window suddenly felt like a glaring vulnerability in the otherwise secure classroom. I held my breath, realizing with growing dread that the open window could provide an easy entry point for the intruder. But then, to my horror, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my classroom. They were slow, methodical, as if someone was trying not to be heard. Each step seemed to echo in the silent corridor, growing louder as they approached. Acting on instinct, I ducked behind my desk, wedging myself into the knee hole. The solid wood sides offered some concealment, but I knew I was far from safe. My mind raced, trying to think of a better hiding spot, but I was afraid any movement would give me away. Time seemed to crawl as I strained my ears, trying to track the intruder's movements. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I heard the handle rattling. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away, but thankfully, the door was locked. My relief was short-lived. To my absolute horror, I heard a key slide into the lock. As a teacher, I knew only staff and security should have keys to the classrooms. Who could this be? The door slowly opened, the hinges creaking slightly. I could hear someone moving around the room, their footsteps muffled on the carpeted floor. They seemed to be searching for something, opening cabinets and drawers. My mind raced, trying to understand what they could be looking for in a physics classroom. The intruder's movements brought them closer to my hiding spot. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look behind the desk. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to spring into action if discovered. Just then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I'd forgotten to silence it. The sound, though brief, seemed deafening in the quiet room. The footsteps abruptly stopped. I could almost feel the intruder's attention zeroing in on my location. In a moment of panic, I decided to make a run for it. It was a risky move, but staying hidden no longer felt like an option. I burst out from behind the desk, startling the intruder. In the dim light filtering through the blinds, I could see it was a young man in a dark hoodie, his face partially obscured. He lunged for me, his hand reaching out to grab my arm. I managed to dodge, my heart pounding in my ears. I sprinted for the door, knocking over a chair in my haste. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps right behind me. I raced down the hallway. Every sound seemed amplified in the empty corridor. I headed for the main entrance. As I neared the front doors, I saw a ray of hope. A security guard was just entering the building, alerted by the commotion. I shouted for help, pointing behind me to indicate the threat. The guard's eyes widened as he took in the situation, and he immediately radioed for backup. The intruder, seeing the guard, turned around and ran back. More security personnel arrived within minutes. A thorough search of the building was conducted. After about 20 minutes, they found the man trying to escape through a fire exit and apprehended him. The sense of relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I found myself shaking, the full impact of what had happened hitting me. The police arrived soon after, and I gave my statement, still trying to process the events. The lockdown was lifted about an hour later. While shaken, I was relieved that no one had been hurt. The principal held an assembly to address the students and staff, assuring us that security measures would be reviewed and enhanced. It turned out the intruder was a former student who had been struggling with severe mental health issues. He had broken into the school during a psychotic episode, with no clear motive or plan. His erratic behavior and lack of clear purpose made the situation even more unsettling. Thankfully, he was unarmed. The familiarity of the intruder somehow made the experience even more unsettling. This happened a long time ago when I was still in school, just a week before my 12th birthday. It was summer vacation, and I was home with my older sister in our suburb of Detroit. Our parents were both high-powered corporate lawyers at a prestigious firm in downtown Detroit. Their work often kept them at the office late into the evening, leaving my sister and me alone during weekdays. We were thrilled to have the house to ourselves, enjoying the taste of independence. My sister had just hit the big 17, and suddenly she was too cool for school. Or more accurately, too cool to hang with her lame little sister. Even though she was supposed to keep an eye on me, she bailed to meet her friends. I felt a knot in my stomach as she walked out the door, leaving me alone in our quiet suburban house. The house was emptier and eerier without her presence. It turned out, in her rush to leave, she had forgotten to lock the front door. I curled up on the couch, losing myself in the flicker of the TV screen. Time flew by, and before I knew it, it was getting dark outside. As dusk settled in, nature called, and I reluctantly peeled myself off the couch. Halfway down the hallway, a sound froze me in my tracks. The front door creaked open, the noise echoing through our quiet house. My first thought was of my sister. She must be cutting it close to our parents' arrival. They'd be home from work in an hour or two, and she'd promised to be back before then, as she didn't want to get in trouble for leaving me home alone. Relieved at no longer being alone, I quickened my pace towards the living room, ready to tease her about her timing. When I turned the corner to the living room, my relief evaporated instantly. It wasn't my sister at all. It was Brian, a man in his 50s from our neighborhood, known for being a bit slow and having a history of inappropriate behavior, which I don't want to go into details about. Brian had always been a source of discomfort, but never a real threat, until now. My heart was racing as I tried to stay calm and think of what to do. I quickly ran into my parents' bedroom and locked the door behind me. It was the farthest room from the living room, with a solid lock on the door. While I was in there, I could hear him moving around in the house. I heard him walking down the hallway, and then I heard a knock on the bedroom door. My body was paralyzed with fear as I heard Brian trying to coax me out. He was saying he just wanted to talk, that we could hang out. I knew Brian had always been seen as harmless before. Just a bit odd, but not this time. He had never invaded someone's home like this before. I was so scared that I couldn't even respond. I stayed silent and prayed he would go away, but he didn't. He kept knocking on the door and trying to convince me to come out. Then I did the only thing I could do. I screamed. I screamed as loud as I could, until my voice gave out. After what felt like hours, I heard the sound of a police car approaching. Brian must have heard it too, because he immediately ran away. I heard the fading sounds of footsteps, and then a door slam. Even after the sirens stopped, I remained frozen in my parents' bedroom, too terrified to move. It wasn't until I heard multiple voices and the sound of heavy boots moving through the house that I finally unlocked the door and cautiously emerged. I made my way towards the voices, my legs still shaky. The officers quickly saw me and asked if I was all right. They continued to search the entire house, but as I expected, there was no sign of Brian. Then they told me that a neighbor had heard me screaming and called them. I never found out who it was, but I really wanted to thank them for the help. I was so grateful that the police had come, and I was also angry with my sister. She knew I shouldn't be left alone, but she still went out anyway. I couldn't believe that my sister had put me in danger like that. I figured Brian must have seen her leave and realized I was home alone, leading to this frightening incident. The police called my parents at work, and they rushed home immediately. When they arrived, their faces pale with worry, they were horrified to hear the full story from me and the officers. My parents were furious with my sister and made sure she knew how serious the situation was. She was grounded for months. Brian, in his slow, confused way, had tried to brush off the whole ordeal as a harmless misunderstanding, completely oblivious to how terrifying and inappropriate his actions were. In the end, he was charged with trespassing and ordered to stay away from our family. Just prior to the pandemic, I had a really creepy experience. For some context, I live by myself, and this was the same situation when this story occurred. It started one night when I was home, probably around 9:30 p.m. At the time I was busy unpacking boxes. I had just moved into the house. Then I heard a knock at the door. I thought it was unusual. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it is a bit late for unannounced arrivals. I walked over and looked out the window. There was a man standing there. Unsure if I should open the door, I waited to see if he would walk away. About a minute later, he knocked again. I decided to answer and opened the door for him. Right when I opened the door, he introduced himself as Derek, my neighbor, and welcomed me to the neighborhood. I thanked him for the welcome and started to close the door, thinking that he'd turn around and leave. But as I was closing the door, he remained there, staring at me. I felt a strange unease. After a moment of silence, I turned away and returned to my unpacking. About an hour later, while I was in the kitchen, I heard a cough coming from outside. It startled me, and I went to the door to see who was there. I looked through the peephole and saw Derek still standing there, his gaze fixed on the door, just staring at it. I swear he didn't even blink. Panic set in. I yelled through the door that if he didn't leave, I would call the police. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation. The operator assured me that help was on the way and advised me to stay inside. As I stood by the door, I kept watching through the peephole. Derek hadn't moved. He continued to stare at the door. My anxiety grew. It was as if he was waiting for me to open the door again. After about 20 minutes, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. Relief washed over me, but I was still on edge. I unlocked the door just enough to let the officers in, keeping a watchful eye on Derek. Inside, the officers quickly assessed the situation. They said they would step outside to speak with Derek. After a brief conversation, they returned and informed me that Derek claimed he had just stopped by to welcome me and was about to leave when they arrived. They instructed him to leave the property, and he finally walked away, glancing back at me one last time. Once they were sure he had left, the officers checked in with me. They said they would keep an eye on the neighborhood for a while and advised me to call again if I felt unsafe. I nodded, still shaken by the encounter. That night, I double-checked that I had locked all the doors and ensured the windows were locked too. I was determined not to let this man invade my sense of safety, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he might come back. For days, I felt paranoid. I avoided going outside alone after dark and kept my phone close at hand. I didn't see Derek again for a week. Then, one evening, while I was in the living room, I noticed someone walking by outside in front of my house. It was him again, stopping to look at my place. I watched him through the window as he lingered there, glancing around as if searching for something. I tried to dismiss it and went back to what I was doing. But later, as I drove to work, I saw a car behind me at a stoplight. I looked in my mirror and almost couldn't believe it. It was Derek again. He was wearing sunglasses, so I couldn't be completely sure, but it felt like he was following me. I made several turns, and each time, I noticed the car still behind me. My heart raced as I pulled into the parking lot at work. When I parked, I saw the car continue past. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For the next few days, I remained alert, frequently checking my windows. I didn't see Derek again until one night, shortly after midnight. I was about to drift off to sleep when I heard a loud noise coming from outside. I got up and stepped into the hallway, and that's when I heard another loud bang. This time it seemed to come from the side of the house. Someone was hitting it with something. I had no idea who it was or what they were doing, so I quickly returned to my bedroom, locked the door, and called the police. I told them I believed someone was trying to break in. A short time later, I heard a door open. It sounded like it was the door to the laundry room, which had an exit leading to the rear of the property. Then, I definitely heard movement inside the house. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, letting her know that I could now hear movement inside the house and suspected they had entered from the rear. She assured me the officers would arrive soon. Since the front door was definitely locked, she said she would instruct the officers to check the rear entrance. A few minutes later, I heard the police car arrive. Soon after, I could hear footsteps as the officers made their way to the rear of the house. Eventually, I heard them enter. I stayed in the bedroom, listening intently as the dispatcher reassured me that the police were inside and handling the situation. Once she confirmed they had Derek in custody, I thanked her and we ended the call. After hanging up, I stayed in the bedroom for a few more moments, gathering my nerves. When everything seemed quiet, I cautiously opened the door and stepped out. The officers were already escorting Derek out of the house, and a wave of relief washed over me, knowing he wouldn't be a problem anymore. I never found out why he had been watching me, or what he intended to do. The uncertainty lingered in my mind long after that night. It was a late Sunday night in early November, and I was driving back to Ann Arbor after visiting my parents in Columbus, Ohio, for the weekend. The 3-hour journey stretched out in front of me, the road empty and dark, with only the occasional semi-truck passing by. A light drizzle had started, and I was tired, eager to get back to my college apartment and collapse into bed. That's when I saw her standing by the side of the road, her thumb out, a hitchhiker. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about her seemed harmless. She looked to be in her early 20s, dressed in a University of Michigan hoodie and jeans, carrying a small backpack with a Wolverine's logo. I slowed down and pulled over. As my Toyota Corolla came to a stop on the gravel shoulder, I asked her where she was heading. She leaned in through the window and replied that she was trying to get back to campus in Ann Arbor if it wasn't too much trouble. I unlocked the door and told her to hop in. She climbed in, thanking me, the scent of rain and cigarettes following her. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds being the engine, the the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers and the tires on the wet pavement. She seemed normal enough, making small talk about midterms and how quiet I-75 was at night. After a while, the conversation died down, and she seemed to get more comfortable. She asked if I had a cigarette, so I handed her one. She lit it with a battered Zippo lighter, taking a deep drag, and stared out the window at the passing farmlands. Then, out of nowhere, she commented on how not many people stopped for hitchhikers these days. Too many crazies out there. Her tone had shifted. I forced a laugh, agreeing, but it felt off. She kept glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, her fingers tapping nervously on her knee. I asked her where exactly on campus she was heading, but she just waved her hand vaguely, saying she'd tell me when to stop. Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. The highway was completely deserted, and my unease grew as she shifted in her seat, her movements becoming more erratic. Then, without warning, she lunged for the steering wheel. The car swerved wildly, tires screeching on the wet road as I fought to regain control. I managed to push her back into her seat, but she was strong, eyes wild and desperate. She hissed that I wasn't going anywhere and pulled out a switchblade from her hoodie pocket. My heart raced as the blade glinted in the dashboard's dim light. I slammed on the brakes, sending both of us jolting forward against our seatbelts. Before she could react, I unclipped my seatbelt and threw myself at her, wrestling for the knife. The struggle in the confined space was brutal. She slashed at me, and I felt the sharp pain of the blade grazing my forearm. I grabbed her wrist, slamming it against the door until the knife clattered to the floor mat. She was stronger than she looked, pinning me against the seat, her hands squeezing around my throat, cutting off my air. The smell of cigarettes on her breath was overwhelming. Desperately, I kicked out, my foot connecting with her knee. She screamed in pain, loosening her grip just enough for me to break free. I scrambled for the door handle, flinging it open and tumbling out onto the wet road. As I hit the ground, I clutched the car keys tightly in my fist. Her curses echoed as I hit the asphalt and rolled away from the car. I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, my heart racing as I sprinted towards the tree line. The cold November rain soaked through my clothes, but I didn't stop. I could hear her behind me. Up ahead, I saw a narrow path leading into the woods. I darted off the road, hoping to lose her in the trees. The branches scratched at my face and arms, thorns tearing at my jeans, but I kept going. Her footsteps were getting closer. I spotted a fallen oak tree and scrambled over it, crouching behind the moss-covered trunk. I held my breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. As she drew closer, her shadowy figure moved through the trees, the knife still glinting in her hand. She stopped a few feet from where I was hiding, looking around. Her breathing was ragged, her face twisted with frustration, illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning. I prayed she wouldn't see me. After a few tense moments, she cursed under her breath and started back toward the road. I waited until I was sure she was gone before I stood up, my legs shaking. As I started back to the car, I heard a noise behind me. She had spotted me and was now in pursuit. I ran through the forest, no longer trying to be quiet. When I got to the road, I saw the Toyota Corolla still there, its door open. I ran up to the car, keys in hand. I could hear her getting closer. I got into the driver's seat and locked the doors just as she came out of the trees. My hands were shaking as I tried to start the car. The hitchhiker reached the car and tried to open the door. I managed to start the engine and drove away quickly. I saw her in the rearview mirror as I sped off. I drove until I reached the next small town. I pulled into a BP gas station, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. The night attendant looked concerned as I walked in, probably noticing the cuts, bruises, and mud on my arms and clothes. He asked if I was okay, and I nodded, barely able to speak. I asked to use the phone to call the police, explaining that I'd lost mine during the attack. As I sat there waiting, clutching a cup of bad vending machine coffee, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to losing my life. I had tried to do a good deed, and it almost cost me everything. When the police finally arrived, they took my statement and promised to look for the woman. I thanked them, but deep down, I knew it would be a long time before I felt safe driving alone again. I've been on and off Tinder for about 3 years now. I've experimented with other dating apps too, but Tinder was my go-to choice. I vividly recall stumbling upon her profile for the first time. Her bio was clever and engaging, sure, but it was her photos that truly blew my mind. There were plenty of beautiful women on Tinder, but she was on a whole different level. Tall, slim, tanned, with blonde hair and striking features, she looked like a Nordic queen. In my opinion, she was way above and beyond anyone else. I swiped right and set my phone aside for the evening, not really expecting anything to happen. After all, she was easily an 11 out of 10, and I'd rate myself, on my best day, maybe a 7. I'm balding for starters, and pimples have taken up residence on my face, like unwanted squatters. Most women wouldn't look twice at me, but when I'm on stage with my guitar, everything changes. My music is what usually grabs women's attention. It's the one thing that makes me stand out. I'm someone who hates notifications on my phone, so I keep them turned off for almost everything. As a result, it wasn't until the next afternoon when I opened the Tinder app that I was ecstatic to see we had matched. We started messaging right away, and I was instantly captivated by her intelligence, sharp sense of humor, and charm. Our exchanges felt natural and engaging as we shared stories about our interests, careers, and backgrounds. Not only was she stunning, but she was also funny and intelligent. I had hit the trifecta, or so I thought. The connection was instantaneous, leading us to arrange a meetup at a local bookstore cafe. Of course, I couldn't shake the nagging worry that this might be too good to be true. Maybe she was a catfish, using old or heavily filtered photos, and I was just setting myself up for disappointment. But the moment I laid eyes on her, all my doubts vanished. She was tall and slim, with flowing blonde hair, but even more stunning than her pictures suggested. We embraced, ordered our drinks, and lost ourselves in conversation about the most trivial things. We hit it off right away, but as the date went on, I couldn't shake the creeping feeling of imposter syndrome. Like I wasn't good enough for someone as perfect as her. Still, I was already looking forward to our next encounter. We began seeing each other more frequently, exploring the city's hidden gems together. We visited art galleries, tried out quirky food trucks, and spent hours in the city's numerous parks, simply enjoying each other's company. We shared our aspirations, anxieties, uncertainties, and plans for the future. I felt I'd found someone who truly got me, someone who made me feel wanted. But as time progressed, things started to shift. She'd text me constantly, even when she knew I was at band practice or hanging out with my buddies. If my response wasn't immediate, she'd become upset and accuse me of neglecting her or cheating on her. I know most guys, myself included before all this, would go to great lengths for a woman like her. But once you get past the surface, it became clear that beauty alone can't sustain a relationship. Her insecurities slowly turned what seemed like a dream into a nightmare. She began showing up at my house unannounced, even when I had prior commitments. Initially, I interpreted this as a sign of her affection, her way of showing how much she cared, but it soon became overwhelming and claustrophobic. When I tried to discuss it with her, she'd become defensive and irate, accusing me of flirting with other girls and not truly caring about her. She'd even ask if she wasn't hot enough for me, throwing out those irrational questions that only deep-rooted insecurity could fuel, no matter how stunning someone might be. None of her accusations held any truth, and it felt like she was living in an alternate reality where I was her sole source of happiness and purpose. I felt like I was constantly treading on thin ice around her, unable to do anything without feeling guilty or anxious. Her calls and messages became exhausting, and I began to dread them. I felt like I couldn't have any time to myself, catch up with my friends, or pursue my own interests. One afternoon, she showed up at the music store where I worked part-time and caused a commotion. When I attempted to ask her to leave, my co-workers had to intervene and escort her out. It was mortifying. Thankfully, my manager was understanding and just advised me to take a breather and compose myself. I was relieved that the incident didn't cost me my job. After that episode, I realized I had to end our relationship. I tried to break it off gently over a video call, but she refused to accept it. She pleaded for another chance, swearing she'd change and never repeat such behavior, but deep down, I knew things wouldn't improve. I needed to extricate myself from the situation before it escalated further. Then the barrage of messages intensified. At first, her texts were desperate and pleading, professing her love and need for me. However, they quickly morphed into angry threats, accusing me of leading her on and betraying her. She'd send me screenshots of my social media posts with my friends, saying things like, "I see what you're up to," and "I'm always watching." She'd turn up at places she knew I frequented, trying to catch me off guard. I was terrified and at a loss. I tried blocking her number, but she'd just get new ones. I made all my social media accounts private, but somehow she still managed to view my posts. Even when I approached the police, they said their hands were tied unless she physically harmed me. The situation was maddening. One evening, as I was strumming my guitar in my living room, I heard a disturbance outside my apartment. When I peered out the window, I saw her standing there, staring up at me. Panic-stricken, I secured all the doors and windows before calling the police. She began hammering on the door, attempting to force it open. When the police arrived, they found her intoxicated and causing a scene. After repeatedly warning her to stop, they had no choice but to arrest her for public intoxication and disturbing the peace. She spent the night in custody. She was released the following day, but due to the incident, I was eventually granted a restraining order. After that, the situation improved significantly, though I never discovered what sparked the change. Perhaps it was the fear of legal repercussions, or maybe her loved ones intervened. Whatever the reason, I'm grateful that things didn't worsen. It's been about 18 months since that night, and while things have calmed down considerably, I still feel a sense of unease. My band has been a great source of support throughout all of this. Throwing myself into our music has been therapeutic, and we're starting to gain a bit of a following in the local indie scene. It's given me something positive to focus on and a reason to look forward. Maybe I'll write a song about this whole ordeal next, and who knows, you might see us at the top of the charts. But jokes aside, I know most men would have dreamt of being in my shoes, dating someone as stunning as her. Trust me though, it wasn't worth the price I ended up paying. In 2018, I was working as a driver for Uber Eats near my university. I needed the job to cover my tuition and living expenses. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped me make ends meet while studying. One night seemed ordinary at first. I started my work at 8 p.m. and spent the next few hours delivering meals from various restaurants. After a quick coffee break at a 24-hour gas station, I was back on the road by 11:30 p.m. Around midnight, my phone pinged with a new order from a late-night sushi place. The delivery address was for an office building in a business park about 15 minutes away. It wasn't uncommon to get orders from people working late, so I didn't think much of it at the time. I headed to the sushi place parked out front and picked up the neatly packed order. The restaurant was quiet at this hour, with just a few staff cleaning up for the night. The route led me away from the busy downtown area, past the quieter commercial district, right into a sprawling business park filled with various office buildings. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, with only the occasional car passing by. I relied on Google Maps to guide me through the unfamiliar area. When I turned into the correct driveway, I followed it to a modern 5-story office building. The address matched the one on my Uber Eats app. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only 2 cars present, a black sedan and an old pickup truck. I double-checked the address on my app to ensure there wasn't a mistake. Everything seemed correct. I parked my car near the main entrance and grabbed the insulated delivery bag. As I approached the glass doors, I noticed most of the building was dark, except for a few lights on the 3rd floor. I pressed the intercom button and waited. After a moment, a man's voice crackled through the speaker, telling me he'd be right down. A minute later, the door opened, and a man in his 40s, dressed in a rumpled dress shirt and slacks, greeted me with a tired smile. He thanked me for the delivery, explaining that he and his team were pulling an all-nighter for a big presentation. I handed him the food and swiped to complete the delivery on my app. He added a $10 tip on the app and gave me another $10 in cash. As I was about to leave, he asked if I could do him a quick favor. He requested help carrying some of the food to the 3rd floor. I hesitated, remembering Uber Eats' policy about not entering buildings. But the generous tip made me consider it. Still, the situation didn't sit right with me. The man noticed my hesitation and quickly added that their elevator was out of order, which is why he needed help. He started walking towards the stairwell, gesturing for me to follow. Against my better judgment, I followed him into the building. The lobby was dark, lit only by emergency exit signs. As we approached the stairwell, I noticed how quiet the building was. No sounds of a working team, no distant voices or footsteps. We climbed to the 2nd floor in silence. As we reached the landing, the man suddenly stopped and turned to face me. His expression had changed completely, from tired friendliness to something much colder. He then informed me, in a low and menacing tone, that we were alone in the building, and that no one knew of my presence there. As he spoke, his hand moved to his pocket, and I glimpsed something metallic catching the dim light. In that moment, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I dropped the food bag and bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding. I heard him shout and start to chase after me. I burst out of the building and sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. As I started the engine, I saw him emerge from the building, looking around frantically. Shaking, I drove to a well-lit gas station and called the police. By the time they arrived at the office building, the man was long gone. The police found the building empty, with no signs of any late-night work team. It was clear he had set some kind of trap. What he had planned, I'll never know, and I hope I never find out. Since that night, I've never broken company policy again, no matter how good the tip might be. I'd spent most of my career patrolling the quiet highways and back roads of the Great Plains. Out here, it's miles of open farmland and long stretches of sky with barely a soul in sight. Most nights were peaceful, maybe even boring. Just a wandering drunk or a stray animal crossing the road. But not this one. That night, I was out on a night shift, making my rounds through the rural roads. By midnight, the town's already asleep, and there's hardly any traffic. My job usually involves running speed checks, making sure no one's trespassing on farmland, and occasionally checking on a parked vehicle. It's routine work. But tonight, as I drove down the empty road with fields and trees on either side, something was different. Out of nowhere, a loud sound pierced through the stillness. I slowed right down and tried to place it, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from or even what it was. The sound was unsettling, to say the least. I pulled over and sat for a second to listen. It came again, this time more like a voice. But I couldn't tell if it was a man, woman, or even a child, or what they were saying. I tried to call it in, but the radio was dead, just static. I turned on the siren lights and got out of the cruiser, flashlight in hand and gun holstered at my side. I shined my light toward the trees, but saw nothing. The sound was coming from somewhere within the woods. "Who's out there?" I yelled, stepping toward the tree line. A woman's scream pierced the air. She sounded panicked. I froze for a moment, then called out again, asking who it was and if she was okay. The next response, it sounded like an elderly person, weaker but still desperate. I grabbed my handheld radio, trying to call for backup again, but it was also dead. I took a few steps closer. I called out once more, but the scream had changed. It no longer sounded like a woman or an elderly person. It sounded deeper now, maybe a man. I hesitated but took a few more steps forward. The next time I called out, it shifted again. This time, it was higher pitched, like a child. I pushed deeper into the woods. I was at least 50 paces into the woods now, but the screams weren't getting any closer. No matter how far I walked, they stayed just out of reach. The voices, though, continued to shift. The frantic cry of a woman became the plea of an elderly person, then a man's deep shout, followed by the shrill wail of a child. Each time it changed, The distance never did. I stopped in my tracks. This wasn't right. Every instinct I had told me to turn back, that I was walking into something that I couldn't explain. So I did. I turned right around and headed back towards the cruiser. But even as I did, I could still hear the screams trailing me, never getting closer, never getting further, just remaining the same distance. Finally, I made it back to the cruiser. The siren lights were still flashing, and the headlights were still shining down the dark, empty road. I felt a wave of relief just to be back in the safety of the car. I tried again to call it in once more, but the radio was still static. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I hadn't been sleeping well prior, not since I'd started back on the night shift. The late hours had been getting to me, but it was more than that. I'd only just returned from bereavement leave after losing my wife to cancer a few months before. She was my high school sweetheart, my best friend. The grief had been screwing with me, making me question my own thoughts, the meaning of my life, and sometimes even my will to keep going. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just in my head. I still patrol the same roads, and I've never experienced anything like it again. Thankfully. Back in the late 90s, when I was 14 years old and a freshman in high school, something happened that I'll never forget. I was hanging out with some friends before class started, just talking about random stuff that 14-year-olds talk about. Then the warning bell rang, and we all had to go to our classes. I took my time getting to my class, because my teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was pretty chill and didn't care if you were a little late. She usually started class a few minutes late anyway, because she was always busy with drama club stuff. As I was walking to class, the school bell rang again, meaning school was starting and I'd be late. But I didn't really care, and just kept walking. The hallways were empty now. Then the intercom came on, saying the school was going into lockdown. I was really confused because everything seemed fine to me. I kept walking to my classroom, thinking it might just be a drill or something. When I got to the hallway where my classroom was, I stopped dead in my tracks. At the end of the hallway, there was this big guy wearing a bright orange hunting vest and camo pants. He had on combat boots and was carrying this huge olive green duffel bag. It took me a second to realize what was happening. The guy hadn't seen me yet, but then he turned and looked my way. I quickly ducked back around the corner, freaking out. He was standing right by my classroom, so I couldn't go there now. The hallways were totally empty, and I started to panic. I knew the school pretty well, so I went to the closest place I could think of, which was the janitor's closet. I was hoping I could hide there until everything was over. I sat in there trying to listen for any sounds, praying the guy wouldn't come in. I was terrified the whole time and didn't make a sound. I stayed in that closet, trying not to freak out completely, for maybe about 45 minutes. It was super quiet, and I couldn't hear much, but at one point, I did hear footsteps, and it really scared me. I had no idea who it was, but luckily they walked past, and then it was quiet again. I just hoped that guy I saw wouldn't come into the closet. Finally, I decided to leave. I hadn't heard anything in forever, so I thought it might be safer to get out of there. I stepped out, and the hallways were still empty and quiet. The lockdown was still going on, and I had no clue what was happening. I started walking really fast back to my classroom, being super careful and looking around everywhere. I was about halfway there when I heard a noise that made me freeze. It was footsteps coming from the next hallway around the corner. It was happening all over again. I felt that same fear and shock hit me. I turned around fast and went down another hallway, trying to avoid whoever was coming. I looked back for a split second and saw the guy in the orange vest starting to come around the corner. At that point, I swear I could have outrun a cheetah. For the first time in my life, I was seriously running for my life, and nothing else mattered. It was like time slowed down and my senses went into overdrive. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, feel every breath burning in my lungs, and see every detail of the hallway with crystal clarity. My mind was completely blank except for one thought: keep moving. I just kept running. Eventually, I stopped because I couldn't hear the guy behind me anymore. I caught my breath and started walking towards the exit, hoping to find a way out. When I got to the main doors, I saw a bunch of cop cars outside. My legs felt like jelly. This officer spotted me and waved me over. I just stumbled out and sat on the curb, trying to catch my breath. They told us later they caught the guy, but we never found out why he did it. After that, things were pretty rough for a while. I had trouble sleeping and kept jumping at every little noise. My parents found this group for kids who'd been through scary stuff like that. It helped, I guess, but it took a long time to feel normal again. It's been like 24 years now. The school changed a lot after it happened. They put in metal detectors at the entrances and hired more security guards. It was weird at first, but we got used to it. Every time I hear about a school shooting or lockdowns on the news, it hits me real hard. My heart races, and for a moment, I'm right back in that hallway, scared out of my mind. It's like reliving it all over again. What really gets to me, though, is how these incidents get turned into political arguments. People start debating gun laws or mental health policies before the victims' families have even had time to grieve. It makes me so angry. They have no idea what it's like to be in that situation, to feel that fear. I just wish they'd focus on helping the people affected instead of scoring political points. I'm just glad no one got hurt that day at my school. But man, going through something like that, it really messes with your head. I wouldn't want anyone to have to deal with that, ever. And I really hope someday we can figure out how to stop these things from happening, politics aside. Last year, this terrifying event occurred. I live alone in my brownstone in Brooklyn. I was watching a Friday night Yankees game. During a commercial break, an ad for some fast food chain came on. It made me realize just how hungry I was. I decided to order from Benihana through the DoorDash app. I love their hibachi chicken rice and pork gyoza. I placed my order, selecting the leave at door option. The app said it'd be about 30 minutes. Perfect. Just enough time for a quick bath. I'd been putting it off all day, and now seemed like the ideal moment. I left the game on and headed to the bathroom. The warm water felt amazing. I lost track of time, enjoying the steam and the quiet. When I finally stepped out, I realized I'd forgotten to bring clothes with me. No big deal. I'm alone, and my bedroom's just across the hall. I wrapped a towel around my wet hair and opened the bathroom door, ready to dash to my room. As I stepped into the hallway, I could still hear the game on the TV. The crowd was cheering loudly. I heard a coughing noise from the living room that didn't sound like it was coming from the TV. My heart started racing. I covered myself with the towel, removing it from my hair, grabbed my baseball bat that stood a few steps away in the hallway. Unfortunately, I had left my phone on the coffee table after ordering dinner. I peeked around the corner into the living room, and there he was, the delivery guy, sitting on my couch, eyes glued to the game. I froze. Here I was, almost naked, with a stranger in my house. He must have heard me because he turned and saw me. His eyes went wide, and he jumped up, spilling my food all over the floor. He stammered an apology, explaining that he had knocked, but there was no answer. And he could hear the Yankees game. He said he was a big Yankees fan and just wanted to check the score real quick. Since the door was unlocked, he'd brought the food in, intending to leave it on the table, but then got caught up watching the game. I was too shocked to speak. I just pointed at the door, and he ran out, leaving my spilled dinner behind. Once he was gone, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I contacted DoorDash customer service, who were horrified and assured me they'd handle it. The next day, Benihana's manager called to apologize and offer free meals. I appreciated it, but haven't been able to order food delivery since then. I work at a small wildlife lodge on the edge of a national park, primarily during the night shifts. My main responsibilities include managing the front desk, handling guest inquiries, and monitoring the security cameras for any wildlife entering the premises. It's usually quite peaceful, as our lodge isn't very large or well known. That evening, the lodge was nearly vacant, with just a handful of guests. I was reviewing trail maps at the desk when I noticed a woman approaching the main entrance. I stood to greet her as she came in. Her eyes were bloodshot and tired, and she mumbled that she needed a cabin for the night. It was evident she was exhausted, but I proceeded to check her in and gave her a cabin key. Our policy was to accommodate walk-ins as long as we were below 80% capacity. She headed towards the cabins, and I returned to my desk and the trail maps. Hours later, while still at the front desk, I heard a rustling sound from outside. It sounded like someone was rummaging through our compost bins, likely a bear looking for an easy meal. Cautious, I walked to where the noise came from and saw the same woman I had checked in, digging through our recycling area. I asked if everything was all right. She turned, her gaze unfocused and distant. I repeated my question, but she just stared blankly. Wanting to avoid any confrontation, I decided to leave her be and returned to my post. Time passed quietly, with no sounds of movement or activity. Around 2 a.m., to stay alert, I decided to do a perimeter walk and check the grounds. Just as I was nearing the front desk again, a loud crash echoed from the direction of the cabins. Pausing, I listened, then walked towards the cabin area, where I thought the noise originated. The silence was now unnerving. As I moved down the path, all was quiet, but at the end, I noticed cabin 7's door slightly ajar. I listened, but heard nothing. Cautiously, I called out, announcing myself as lodge staff. No response came. I pushed the door open wider, peering inside from the threshold. The cabin appeared empty, but what seemed at the time to be signs of a struggle were evident. A broken lamp on the floor, and clothes strewn about. At that moment, my panicked mind couldn't process what I was really seeing. Feeling uneasy about entering further, I retreated and pulled the door closed, making sure not to touch anything else. This was the cabin I had assigned to the woman, yet her car was still in the parking lot, and her hiking boots were outside the door. The guest book by the front desk showed she hadn't signed out. Given her erratic behavior earlier and these disturbing signs, I knew something was definitely amiss. I quickly returned to the front desk. I scanned all the security camera feeds around the lodge and parking area, but there was no sign of her. Suddenly, I startled. The shrill sound of the emergency phone broke the silence. I answered it. A man's voice quavered through, expressing concern about someone prowling around his cabin in the middle of the night. I apologized and assured him I would investigate. After hanging up, I took a deep breath, my nerves on edge. I was just stepping away from the desk when the phone rang again. This time, another guest, a woman from a different cabin, reported the same unsettling experience. Someone lurking around her cabin during the night. Worried about everyone's safety, I immediately called the park rangers. I waited by the main lodge for their arrival, staying close to the building just in case I needed to secure myself inside quickly. Thankfully, the Rangers arrived promptly, but they couldn't locate the woman. Instead, they found a broken window in her cabin. It appeared she had climbed out. I couldn't fathom how she could have escaped without injury. While the Rangers continued their search, they received information that the car she had arrived in was reported stolen from another camper. 2 days later, we got the shocking news. The woman's body had been found in a ravine about a mile from the lodge. The initial investigation revealed signs of a fall, but that wasn't the whole story. The toxicology report showed high levels of a potent hallucinogenic drug in her system. Suddenly, her erratic behavior made more sense. The Rangers theorized she had been on a bad trip, explaining her confused state and strange actions. In her altered state, she had apparently climbed out the window and wandered into the wilderness. The woman's tragic fate left us all shaken, grateful that no guests had come into direct contact with her that night, but also saddened by the unnecessary loss of life. This experience changed our protocols at the lodge. We now have stricter check-in procedures and regular night patrols. It's a somber reminder that even in the serenity of nature, unexpected dangers can lurk. I left behind the blistering heat of Death Valley to start anew in the sub-zero chill of Alaska's interior. It was a move that would prove to be the most drastic change of my life, and the most terrifying. I was searching for a fresh start, something different, something that would challenge me. The town was tiny, with just a few hundred residents. Winters here were brutal. After a few days, I realized getting around would be tough without the right gear. I needed something to handle the snow and ice, something rugged. That's when I stumbled upon Clyde's ad on Craigslist. It was for a snowmobile, the kind that looked like it could handle anything the harsh backcountry could throw at it. I contacted Clyde through the ad. He responded quickly and seemed eager to sell. He mentioned he'd lived in the area for decades and that the snowmobile had served him well. He explained he didn't use it much anymore, slowing down with age. I told him I was interested, and we arranged to meet the next day. Clyde's cabin was on the outskirts, a good few miles from town. He told me to follow the main road until it ended, and then take a narrow path leading into the woods. "Can't miss it," he'd said. And he wasn't wrong. It was the only place around, ironically looking like it belonged in a horror movie, with its sagging roof, cracked windows, and an old, rusted-through pickup parked out front. I probably should have turned around right then, but alas, I didn't. I had set out early that morning, knowing the daylight hours were short this time of year. The drive was long, and the snow-covered road seemed to stretch forever, leading me to this isolated cabin. I parked and texted Clyde, letting him know I'd arrived. He replied quickly, telling me to come right up and meet him in the garage where the snowmobile was. I stepped out of the car, shivering in the cold. I wasn't used to these harsh conditions, having only been here a few days. The garage was a little ways from the cabin, hidden behind a thick cluster of trees. As I walked, an unsettling feeling crept over me. But I brushed it off and kept going. I was here to get a snowmobile. I reached the garage. It was larger than I expected. It was more like a hangar than a regular garage, spacious enough to store a snowmobile, some heavy equipment, and even a small plane. The door was partially open. I pushed it fully open and stepped inside. The snowmobile was right there, all right, but Clyde wasn't. I called out, but there was no answer. I looked around, trying to spot any sign of him, but it was pitch dark inside, with no internal light source to help. While waiting for Clyde, I started to examine the snowmobile. It was parked right near the door, with just enough light from outside to illuminate it. I turned on my phone's torch to see better, inspecting the engine and controls. Then, suddenly, the garage door slammed shut behind me. I turned quickly, my heart racing. The door's closure cut off the little light from outside, leaving me with just the dim beam from my phone's torch in the now pitch-black space. I texted Clyde, asking what was going on. No response. I tried the door, but it was locked tight. Panic set in as I realized something was very wrong. I heard a shuffling noise, followed by a low mutter. I looked around, but my flashlight didn't catch anything unusual. My mind was racing. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the only answer was silence. I backed up, pressing against the wall. My mind was screaming to get out, but I was trapped. I noticed a door on the far side of the garage, partially hidden behind some old crates. I ran towards the door, hoping it would lead me outside. But about halfway to the door, something snapped around my ankle. A hunter's trap. I felt the most excruciating pain I had ever felt, shooting up my leg. A man emerged from a dim corner, his face hidden behind a ski mask. He'd been standing there all along, just out of sight. He told me to stop struggling, saying it wouldn't help. But I couldn't help it. Adrenaline surged as I fought to free myself from the trap. My phone slipped from my hand, falling to the ground. The man laughed, the most evil laugh you could imagine. I managed to pry the trap open just enough to pull my foot free. Pain shot through my leg, and I could feel blood starting to pool around my ankle. But I ignored it. I grabbed my phone and sprinted, as best I could anyway, toward the small door at the back, hoping it would be unlocked and lead to freedom. The man lunged at me, but I managed to dodge, and thankfully was able to burst through the door into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing me on the snowmobile. My breath fogged up the windshield, and I realized I was hyperventilating. I had to pull myself together. I called the police as soon as I felt safe to do so. Their response time wasn't the greatest. About 4 hours later, they informed me they had been to investigate, but the cabin was empty. Clyde, or whoever he was, had vanished. Inside the garage, they discovered a makeshift pulley system, a simple setup of ropes and weights rigged to pull the door shut from a distance. That explained how Clyde closed the door behind me from the other end of the garage. The place was otherwise empty except for the snowmobile, the trap, and an assortment of crates and other pieces of junk. No sign of the man, no clues left behind. I later found out the cabin had been abandoned for years. Whoever set up the Craigslist ad seemed to want to lure people like me in, and do God knows what to us. My husband and I were renovating our farmhouse, and we had decided to sell the old barn door on Craigslist, as it no longer fitted with our plans. But my husband was at work that day. A buyer had expressed interest, and normally I wouldn't invite a stranger to our home, but this was a large, heavy door that I couldn't easily move. I had no choice but to let the buyer come to me. We agreed to meet at the farmhouse at 2 p.m., and I waited nervously for their arrival. At 1:45 p.m., there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man standing there with his truck parked in the driveway. He said he was there to buy the barn door and admitted to being early. I told him to wait while I went to unlock the barn. As I walked back, I noticed he was lingering around the farmhouse, taking in the surroundings. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed it aside. When I showed him the barn door, he seemed satisfied, but then offered a lower price than we had agreed on. I declined, and he walked back to his truck, saying he'd think about it. A couple of hours later, I noticed a truck parked down the road, near the edge of our property. It looked just like his, a common make and model, but I couldn't see the license plate from where I was standing. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. There were many farms and ranches in the area, and trucks were a staple around here. Maybe it belonged to a neighbor or a delivery person. I didn't give it much thought, assuming it had nothing to do with the earlier visitor. But then, someone knocked on our door, catching me off guard since I wasn't expecting any visitors. My husband wasn't due home for hours. I cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole. It was the man from earlier, holding a large wad of cash and looking friendly and apologetic. He yelled through the door that he was willing to pay the full price for the barn door and wanted to make the purchase. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to open the door. As soon as I opened it, he shoved his way inside, catching me off guard. Before I could react, he pushed me to the ground, ordering me to stay put and threatening that if I moved, things would end badly. I hit the floor hard, my head spinning, feeling utterly helpless. He grabbed my phone and wallet from the coffee table and shoved them into his pocket. Then he walked over to the front door, locked it, and removed the key from the lock. Afterwards, he methodically searched the closet, scattering storage bins and linens until he found something to tie me up with, my sewing measuring tape. He returned to where I lay and began to tie my hands behind my back, telling me to shut up as I tried to speak and plead with him to stop. He demanded to know where the valuables were, but I was too terrified to answer. He tore through my belongings, searching for anything he could find. As he rummaged, I noticed his frantic, jerky movements and the sweat dripping from his brow. His eyes looking around wildly, and it struck me that he might be high on something. I hadn't noticed it before. I was too paralyzed by fear. He moved closer, pressing the knife against my throat. He demanded to know where I kept my jewelry. I tried to explain there was nothing else of value. For the next hour, he tore through our house, overturning furniture, ripping open drawers, and shattering anything in his way. He smashed picture frames, dumped out closets, and tossed everything he could find. I stayed on the floor, hands tied, heart pounding, watching in fear as he destroyed our home, desperate to find something else worth taking. He picked the wrong house, as we really had nothing worth stealing. He came back towards me, the knife now clamped between his teeth. He started to unzip his jeans. His wild eyes locked onto me. I then realized with horror that he planned to assault me. My heart pounded as I braced myself for the unimaginable. Then, the sound of a car pulling up outside startled him. He quickly rushed to go look out the window. I was praying that it was my husband, though he wasn't due home yet. He must have noticed something or someone that worried him. The man told me not to call the police, saying he'd be long gone. Then, without another word, he escaped out the back door, leaving me tied up on the floor. Seconds after he left, my husband unlocked the door and rushed in, his face immediately registering shock at the sight of me on the floor, tied up, and the overturned furniture and broken items around me. He quickly untied my hands and helped me sit up. While he checked me over for injuries, he asked what had happened. I quickly explained about the intruder, everything that had transpired, and that the intruder had just left. He grabbed the largest kitchen knife we had and immediately rushed out the back door, hoping to catch the intruder. By the time he got outside, the intruder's truck was already gone. While my husband was busy being my hero, I called the police, who arrived shortly after. They took statements from both of us, noting every detail we could remember. The crime scene unit came and dusted for fingerprints, taking a few items the intruder had touched as evidence. They assured us they would do their best to track him down, but I didn't feel much hope. It was pure luck that my husband came home from work a few hours earlier than usual that day. If he hadn't, I shudder to think what might have happened. His unexpected arrival was the only reason the intruder didn't have more time to do what he came here to do. We spent the night at a friend's house, too shaken to stay in our own home. The police kept in touch, but weeks passed with no further news. Back when I was in college, I went to a fairly big university. I had a small apartment not far from campus and needed to find a roommate, pronto. All my friends already had places lined up, so I turned to Craigslist to put up an ad. A guy named Edgar reached out in response to the ad and asked if he could come by to check out the place. I agreed, and later that afternoon, he showed up. He seemed pretty ordinary. Nothing particularly stood out about him. He mentioned he wasn't a student, but worked at the university as a janitor. Edgar seemed nice enough on the surface. Our conversation was normal, but for some reason, I couldn't shake this odd feeling about him. I didn't know what it was, just a sense of discomfort I couldn't put my finger on. After he looked around, he thanked me and left, and I told him I'd let him know soon if his application was successful. I was hesitant, not fully convinced at that time, hoping for another candidate. The following morning, I was struggling to get out of bed and was channel hopping on my small TV in my bedroom when I ended up on the news. They were covering a story about a recent assault case, and to my horror, they were reporting on the arrest of a suspect. When his photo appeared on the screen, I froze. It was Edgar, the same guy who had been at my apartment only the day before. I was in disbelief. I never contacted him again, and I probably couldn't anyway if he was behind bars. Fortunately, someone else had reached out later that day, and we hit it off. They moved in shortly afterward. I guess Edgar found accommodation after all, just not the kind he was hoping for.